Greetings, comrades and friends. The International Committee of the Fourth International's online May Day rally, 200 years since the birth of Karl Marx, will begin shortly. Comrades and friends, the International Committee of the Fourth International's online May Day rally will begin in 2 minutes. Greetings. and welcome to the International Committee of the Fourth International's 5th Annual May Day Online Rally, which is also celebrating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx. My name is Joseph Kishore. I'm the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, and I will be moderating today's event. We have a full list of speakers today, joining us from many countries and many time zones. We have individuals listening in from more than 50 countries, from the United States to China, the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Bolivia, from South Africa to Norway. This is the only genuinely international rally to celebrate May Day, the traditional day of international working class solidarity. I encourage all of you who are participating to leave your greetings and statements of support on the rally page. In beginning this rally, I would like to extend the warmest fraternal greetings of the International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website to workers engaged in struggles all over the world. We are meeting today under conditions of a significant upsurge of class conflict, the initial stages of social upheaval that will transform the world. Representing the World Trotskyist movement, we also send our fraternal greetings to all the victims of ruling class injustice, and especially to the cruelly victimized workers of MARUTI SUZUKI in India, to the dispossessed refugees of the Middle East who are subject to brutal persecution by hostile imperialist and capitalist governments that deny their basic rights as human beings, to the victims in Gaza of the homicidal violence of the Israeli regime, and to the immigrants within the United States who are being hunted down in Gestapo-like raids and deported from the country. The International Committee also salutes Julian Assange, who continues his valiant struggle to expose imperialist criminality and pledges to redouble its efforts to secure his freedom. The speeches today from leading members of the International Committee will present a unified global perspective to rally the international working class and youth all over the world in the fight against the escalating attacks on democratic rights, the growing threat of right-wing and state-sponsored authoritarianism, and the mounting danger of catastrophic wars. The opening speech to this rally will be given by Comrade David North. Comrade North is the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website and the national chairman of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. He's been a leading member of the socialist movement for more than 4 decades and has carried out indispensable work in defense of historical truth and for the principles and program of the Trotskyist movement. He's author of numerous works, including In Defense of Leon Trotsky, A Quarter Century of War, The U.S. Drive for Global Hegemony, and the Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, along with countless essays and articles on the World Socialist website, elaborating a socialist perspective and strategy for the international working class. Welcome, Comrade North.
Comrades and friends, May Day 2018 is invested with special significance because we are celebrating not only the day of international working class solidarity, but also the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx. There is no element of exaggeration in the assertion that in the realm of philosophy, economic science, historiography, social theory, and politics, Marx is the most significant figure of the modern era. There is not another thinker who has exerted such a great, enduring, and progressive influence on the development of the social consciousness of humanity and its struggle against oppression and exploitation. Marx's work initiated a new epoch in mankind's understanding of the objective forces that determine the course of historical development, and thus made possible the conscious struggle of the working class for the socialist transformation of society. On the basis of his refutation of Hegel's objective idealism, and the critical appropriation of its dialectical methodology, Marx was able to develop philosophical materialism and apply it to the study of man's socio-economic and political evolution. Prior to Marx, even the most advanced thinkers, above all Hegel and Feuerbach, the greatest of Marx's immediate predecessors, derived social and political relations from some sort of ideal inspiration, be it spiritual or intellectual. Even the great materialist thinkers of the 18th century, such as Helvetius and Baron d'Holbach, whose writings played a critical role in preparing the ground for the great French Revolution of 1789 to 94, believed that the social and political environment was determined by public opinion, that is, by thought. But the idealist conception that social relations are the product of thought is contradicted by reality. Human beings, in their real historical existence, are born into, confront, and adapt themselves unconsciously to the prevailing social relations. Marx, the greatest of all materialist philosophers, uncovered the real origin of man's thought and ideological conceptions, and, as Lenin later explained so concisely, proved that the, quote, conclusion that the course of ideas depends on the course of things is the only one compatible with scientific psychology, end of quote. In his initial elaboration of the materialist conception of history and its subsequent substantiation in the writing of Das Kapital, Marx identified, amidst the seemingly uncoordinated actions of countless millions of human beings, each pursuing what they believed to be their own best interests, driven by their individual passions, ambitions, and contradictory aspirations, those objective forces operating apart from and even independently of individual subjective consciousness that underlie and determine the economic structure of society. Marx rejected any resort to idealist subjectivism in explaining the development of consciousness. Even false conceptions of the nature of society are rooted in and are reflections of objective conditions that exist independently of individuals. Man's inability to perceive and comprehend on the basis of direct and immediate observation the exploitative character of capitalist social relations cannot be explained as a failure of the individual intellect. Rather, it arises from what Marx referred to as the enigmatical character acquired by the products of labor when they assume the form of commodities. As commodities, Marx wrote, a definite social relation between men necessarily assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of relations between things. Marx and his lifelong friend and collaborator, the genius Friedrich Engels, did not invent socialism. The term came into usage as early as the 1830s. Saint-Simon, Owen, and Fourier, in particular, have entered into history as the utopian precursors of Marx and Engels. These remarkable thinkers did not lack for brilliant insights into the defects of existing society and proposals for its more rational organization. But what was absent from their conceptions was an explanation of the objective socio-economic processes from which socialism would actually emerge and the identification of the social force that would fight for its realization. As Marx later recalled, he and Engels, and I quote, proposed a scientific study of the economic structure of bourgeois society as the only tenable theoretical foundation for the fight for socialism, and argued in popular form that it was not a matter of putting some utopian system into effect, but of conscious participation in the historical process revolutionizing society before our very eyes. In explaining the significance of his theoretical work, Marx, somewhat modestly, identified three critical and interrelated achievements. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production, 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3, that this dictatorship itself constitutes no more than a transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. As the bicentenary of Marx's birth has approached, there has been no shortage of assessments by academics and journalists of the significance of his life. The economic disaster of 2008 is still fresh in everyone's memory. Only incorrigible anti-communist reactionaries, blinded by hatred and greed, can deny the monumental scale of Marx's works. Even the phrase, "Marx was right," has appeared fairly frequently. The more intellectually conscientious academics have conducted painstaking research to refute attacks by conventional bourgeois economists on critical elements of Marx's work, such as the labor theory of value and his analysis of the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. Such serious intellectual work should be welcomed and encouraged. However, even the more generous acknowledgments of Marx's genius are constrained by efforts to isolate his theoretical work from its practical political, that is, contemporary revolutionary implications. One or another aspect of Marx's work is lauded as relevant to an understanding of present-day economic conditions. But the appreciation of Marx, the economic theorist, is usually rigidly separated from Marxism as the theory, program, and practice of world socialist revolution. Much of the discussion of the relevance of Marx is dominated and distorted by this strict separation of the consideration of Marx's economic critique of capitalism from the recognition of the enduring significance of Marxism as the historical and contemporary international political movement of the most advanced sections of the working class from the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system. This separation of Marx, the economic theorist, from the socialist revolutionary has a long history. In the course of more than a century, countless efforts have been made to trim Marx's beard, that is, to reconcile Marx with one or another form of bourgeois ideology and petty bourgeois opportunist reformism. Edward Bernstein seized on the opportunity provided by Engels' death in 1895 to disassociate Marxism from socialist revolution and to convert international socialism into nothing more than a movement for social reforms. In the course of the 20th century, the revisions of Marxism assumed an increasingly reactionary character, serving more or less openly as a means of divesting it of any real revolutionary significance and converting it into an apologia for the national opportunism of the mass social democratic and Stalinist parties and the trade unions. The assault on Marx's legacy was facilitated by the unrelenting efforts of petty bourgeois theorists to undermine and discredit the materialist foundations of his theoretical work. As early as the 1890s, barely a decade after his death, German professors were eager to reconcile Marx's revolutionary morality based on the logic of class struggle with Kant's supra-historical categorical imperative. From the very beginning of the 20th century, reflecting the increasing influence of philosophical irrationalism upon broad sections of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia, Marx's insistence on the objective and law-governed character of the historical process came under attack. Thinkers such as Georges Sorel and later Henri de Man claimed that workers required the inspiration of myths, not knowledge of objective laws governing the development of the class struggle against capitalism, to inspire the fight for socialism. Insight into unconscious psychological motivations, rather than the analysis and comprehension of objective economic forces, were declared to be essential for winning workers to the socialist movement. The flight of petty bourgeois intellectuals into irrationalism was combined with an attack on Engels as a vulgar materialist and positivist who had supposedly concealed the individualist and humanist elements of Marxist thought. The young Marx of the philosophical manuscripts of 1844 was elevated above the old Marx of Das Kapital. The main aim of the assault, which has persisted under the influence of Nietzscheanism, existentialism, the Frankfurt School's dilution of materialism with Freudian pseudoscience, and the irrationalist and anti-historical intellectual nihilism of postmodernism, has been to suppress the essential revolutionary content of Marx's work. The intelligence agencies of the capitalist state have not stood on the sidelines in the ideological war against Marxism. The British newspaper, The Independent, in an article published just yesterday, calls attention to a recently declassified CIA research paper. The agency, it reveals, and I quote, read French postmodern theory, concluding that its questioning of the objective basis of reality could be used to undermine the Marxist doctrine of historical inevitability. Millions of dollars were pumped into front organizations such as magazines, publishing houses, and favored academics in order to push postmodern ideas and to create a center-left, thus demarcating the outer boundary of respectable ideas, anything beyond which could be denounced as dangerous and radical lunacy, or perhaps as sectarianism. Thus, the separation of Marx the theoretician from Marx the revolutionary must lead to falsification, first and foremost of Marx's biography. Marx the thinker cannot be understood apart from his political development and activity as a revolutionist. As Franz Mehring observed in his biography of Marx, written 100 years ago, there is no doubt that the incomparable stature of Marx is due not a little to the fact that in him, the man of ideas was indissolubly bound up with the man of action, and that the two mutually complemented and supported each other. As early as March 1843, Marx wrote to Arnold Ruge, I quote, Feuerbach's aphorisms seem to me incorrect only in one respect, that he refers too much to nature and too little to politics. That, however, is the only alliance by which present-day philosophy can become truth. End of quote. This was not a passing phrase, but the key to understanding the essential relation between philosophy and politics in both Marx's work and in the contemporary world. In his thesis on Feuerbach, Marx wrote, the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e., the reality and power, this worldliness of his thinking, in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking, which isolates itself from practice, is a purely scholastic question. End of quote. Philosophy, separated from revolutionary politics, the struggle against the oppression of man by man, is idle speculation, without progressive significance. But politics, without a firm basis in revolutionary theory and knowledge of its development in the course of the long history of the international workers' movement and the struggle for socialism, can lead only to impotent improvisations and outright betrayal. Marx died on March 14, 1883, at the age of 64. Speaking at his graveside, Engels described his beloved friend and comrade in arms as a man of science. But he added, and I quote, this was not even half the man. Marx was before all else a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute in one way or another to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat, which he was the first to make conscious of its own position and its needs, conscious of the conditions of its emancipation. Fighting was his element, and he fought with a passion, a tenacity, and success such as few could rival. Marx the man died 135 years ago. Marxism, understood as the application of dialectical and historical materialist methodology to the study of continuously changing objective socioeconomic conditions, as a science of revolutionary political perspective oriented toward the conquest of political power by the working class, the ending of capitalist exploitation, the abolition of the nation-state system, and the establishment of a socialist society on a world scale, can only be properly understood in its relation to the historical development of the class struggle and the international socialist movement. Engels once wrote that with every advance in the natural sciences, materialism must change its form. That is, it must incorporate into its understanding of the material universe the latest advances in physics, chemistry, evolutionary biology, and mathematics. In like manner, Marxism, as a science devoted specifically to the development of capitalist society, develops through the critical and continuous examination of changes in the capitalist mode of production on a world scale, and through participation in and the critical assimilation of the experiences of the class struggle on an international scale. All invocations of dialectics that exclude this critical element of Marxism, that ignores or glosses over the lessons of the revolutionary struggles of the past century, are nothing but an exercise in empty phrase-mongering and petty bourgeois political charlatanry. The celebration of the bicentenary of Marx's birth is of genuine revolutionary political significance only to the extent that it is based on the whole historical development of Marxism. In the course of the 20th century, the working class passed through monumental historical experiences of imperialist wars, of revolutions and counter-revolutions. Marxism does not exist in the abstract or as a set of conclusions formulated more than a century ago. Rather, it exists as the real movement that represents the continuity of the conscious struggle within the international working class to develop the program, perspective, and practice of world socialist revolution. In 1938, Leon Trotsky founded the Fourth International in revolutionary opposition to the counter-revolutionary Stalinist bureaucracy, whose betrayals had led to catastrophic defeats of the working class. In the course of 80 years, the Fourth International has passed through tumultuous struggles, not only against the counter-revolutionary parties and organizations of the Stalinists and social democratic bureaucracies, but also against the many forms of opportunism, centrism, and pseudo-leftism that reflect the pressure of the capitalist class and imperialism upon the working class. It is in the struggle against all these forces that the Fourth International, led by the International Committee, has defended and developed Marxism. As we celebrate May Day 2018, there are growing signs that a new period of mass revolutionary struggles by the working class has begun. As is usually the case, the emergence of the working class on the scene of history comes as a surprise, above all to the representatives of the pseudo-left and the anti-Marxist academics whose intellectual and political conceptions are based on the total rejection of the working class as a revolutionary force and, therefore, a no less total belief in the permanence of capitalism. But all that is irrational, all that exists in defiance of the needs of the progressive development of human civilization is unreal. That is, it is condemned by virtue of its own insoluble contradictions to historical oblivion. This sentence has been imposed on capitalist society. It remains to be executed. But has there ever been another ruling class that has displayed such obvious signs of social parasitism, political disorientation, intellectual exhaustion, and moral breakdown? Compared to today's international mafia of oligarchs who control and consume a vast portion of the wealth produced by the labor of billions of people, the bourgeoisie of Marx's era appear almost as a respectable fraternity of philanthropists. The claims of decrepit reformists like Sanders and Corbyn, that the capitalist oligarchs can be persuaded with sweet phrases to accept a more equitable distribution of wealth is nothing less than delusional. As Trotsky once asked, how are tearful appeals to the decency of the rich better than prayers for rain? There is no way to settle accounts with the class that owns and controls the means of production and the global financial networks, along with gigantic military machines, intelligence agencies, and police forces, except through socialist revolution. But is this possible? At a certain stage of their development, Marx wrote, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. These words, in the most profound and immediate sense, define the historical situation that confronts present-day capitalism. For all their wealth and power, the ruling elites stagger from crisis to crisis. The ascendancy of Trump in the United States is only the most visible and ghoulish expression of the universal degeneracy of the capitalist class. But the ascendancy of Trump is of not only symbolic significance. Throughout the 20th century, and especially in the aftermath of World War II, the United States functioned as the ultimate guarantor of the stability and survival of the world capitalist system. It is incapable of playing that role any longer. For the past quarter century, American capitalism, seeking to offset through military operations the consequences of its protracted economic decline, has become the epicenter of geopolitical and financial instability. Within this situation, the resurgence of class struggle in the United States has immense historical significance. The upsurge of class struggle within the United States will imbue the international working class with renewed confidence in the possibility of defeating imperialism, and thereby accelerate the process of global working class radicalization. The laws of history, Trotsky proclaimed upon founding the Fourth International, are more powerful than the bureaucratic apparatus. That prognosis is now being vindicated. The working class is in the process of throwing off the shackles imposed by the old reactionary trade unions and their allies among the cynical organization of the petty bourgeois pseudo-left and its myriad forms of reactionary identity politics. The real progressive and revolutionary struggles of this epoch will be based on the universal emancipatory aspirations of the working class, not on the selfish strivings of one or another fragment of the upper middle class for identity-based privileges. On this historic May Day, the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, the International Committee of the Fourth International proudly proclaims that Trotskyism is the Marxism of the 21st century. We appeal to all our listeners throughout the world, to the hundreds of thousands of readers of the World Socialist website, join our ranks, build new sections of the Fourth International, participate in the fight for the victory of the working class and the establishment of a new and truly humane society based on the socialist principles of international solidarity and the equality of all mankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade North, for that powerful speech and call to action. I have no doubt that if Marx were alive today, he would recognize in this rally and in the work of the International Committee the continuity of the cause to which he devoted his entire life. I would like to reiterate Comrade North's call for all those listening in today to join the fight for socialism, to join the Fourth International, to build sections throughout the world, to contact the ICFI. Fill out the form linked on the side of the rally page at wsws.org/Mayday or on the sidebar at wsws.org. You can also write to us at sep@socialistequality.com. Visit Mehring.com to purchase Comrade North's books, including A Quarter Century of War, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, In Defense of Leon Trotsky, and the Frankfurt School Postmodernism and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, a Marxist Critique. Last year, the World Socialist website marked the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution of 1917 with a series of lectures on the history and lessons of this monumental event in world history. The series began with Comrade North's lecture, Why Study the Russian Revolution, and it concluded with his quote, the place of the October Revolution in world history and contemporary politics. These lectures are gathered in 2 volumes that can be purchased from Mering Books using the link at the side of the rally page. They are essential reading not only for understanding the history of the Russian Revolution, but also in the development of a socialist political strategy for the international working class today. Our next speaker is Comrade Vijay Dias, the General Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Sri Lanka. Comrade Vijay has been for many decades a leading member of the Sri Lankan Trotskyist movement, which has a long and proud tradition of fighting for the unification of the working class and oppressed masses throughout the Indian subcontinent. Under Comrade Vijay's leadership, the SEP is winning growing support throughout South Asia. Vijay is joining us today from Colombo. Welcome, Comrade Vijay.
Comrades and friends, as Comrade David North in his opening speech already explained, Karl Marx, the mighty thinker and revolutionist, blazed the path for the socialist emancipation of the working class by revealing the objective foundation and logic of its struggle against the deprivation of capitalism. Among the most searing and scathing of Marx's writings were his exposures of the violence, banditry, duplicity by which the British bourgeoisie subjugated and economically bled the Indian subcontinent, or in contemporary parlance, South Asia, the crown jewel of its empire. Marx wrote, quote, "The profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, turning from its home, where it assumes respectable forms, to the colonies where it goes naked." Close quote. The 1917 Russian Revolution, the centenary of which we marked last year, was anticipated and politically prepared in Marxist writings, and it gave a tremendous impetus to the struggle against capitalism and imperialism in South Asia. For 3 decades, from the concluding years of the First World War through 1947, South Asia was convulsed by an anti-imperialist upsurge. But, as Leon Trotsky and the Fourth International forewarned, the colonial bourgeoisie that grew up in the shadow of imperialism was hostile to the revolutionary mobilization of South Asia's toilers. Terrified for its own property and fearful of the growing militancy of the world working class, the rival incipient bourgeois of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka negotiated the transfer of power in 1947-48, in which they inherited control of the British colonial apparatus, connived in the partition of South Asia on communal and ethnic lines. Not only were none of the burning problems of democratic revolution resolved, including the eradication of landlordism and casteism, the reactionary state structure was imposed that has frustrated rational economic development, enshrined communalism, fueled reactionary military strategic rivalry between the states of India and Pakistan, and served as a mechanism for imperialism to exercise its domination. 7 decades on, South Asia is a geopolitical and social powder keg. At the ICFI's previous May Day rallies, We have warned that South Asia and the Indian Ocean region have been sucked into the maelstrom of imperialist and great power conflict. For this, US imperialism is principally responsible. It has been waging a brutal neo-colonial war in Afghanistan for the past 17 years, and it has spared no effort to harness India to its reckless military strategic offensive against China. In the process, Washington has dramatically downgraded its relations with its traditional regional ally Pakistan, thereby overturning the regional balance of terror between South Asia's rival nuclear-armed powers. The Indian bourgeoisie, anxious for a leg up on Pakistan and China so as to realize its own predatory great power ambitions, has eagerly accepted Washington's offer to serve as a US imperialist scepter. This process has accelerated under the rule of Narendra Modi and his Hindu supremacist BJP, and with the most ominous consequences for the region and the world. Twice in the course of past 2 years, first in the fall of 2016 with Pakistan, and then last summer with China, India came to the brink of border war, what could have rapidly escalated into an all-out military confrontation, and one potentially involving US and other great powers. Much is made in the Western corporate media of the economic transformation of South Asia as it becomes enmeshed even more tightly with the global capitalist production chains. In reality, the fruits of capitalist development have accrued to a tiny capitalist elite and its political henchmen. For the masses, poverty, economic insecurity, and squalor prevails. The Bangladesh 4 million garment workers toil in sweatshops 6 and even 7 days a week, many earning as little as $65 a month. As part of his Make in India campaign aimed at wooing foreign investors, Modi has boasted that industrial wages in India are no more than a quarter those in China. Since mid-1990s, the number of Indian billionaires have increased 50-fold, from 2 to more than 100, and the share of income appropriated by the top 1% has swelled to 23%. The working class, however, is not just an object of exploitation. Among the tens of millions in South Asia toiling in the new globally connected industries and the broader masses, there is mounting social opposition. In India, recent months have seen a wave of strikes involving, among others, Tamil Nadu bus drivers and teachers, rural health workers in North India, and 1.5 million Uber and Ola drivers, as well as large protests by fishermen, peasants, and Dalits. In an alarmed article this week, India's former National Security Advisor, M.K. Narayanan, urged the government and its ostensible opponents in the political elite to take anticipatory steps to diffuse and, if need be, quell an unrest. The situation within the country, wrote Narayanan, appears far from reassuring. Protests and agitations have a life of their own, and underestimating their potential could be cause for grief. Hence, it might be worthwhile for the nation's leaders to pay heed to the ancient Chinese proverb, quote, "The wind sweeping through the tower heralds a storm rising in the mountain." Similarly, in Sri Lanka, workers, students, and rural and urban poor are rebelling against the brutal IMF-dictated austerity measures being implemented by Sirisena Wickremesinghe coalition government. The resurgence of class struggle is laying bare on what objective force the struggle against the bourgeoisie and its agent of war and the reaction must be based. The great question is to politically arm this developing working class movement with a revolutionary socialist perspective, program, and leadership. The mobilization of the working class as an independent political force requires an unrelenting struggle against the phony establishment left parties and trade union apparatuses and their pseudo-left allies. In India, the Stalinists have responded to the intensification of the class struggle by redoubling their efforts to subordinate the working class to the bourgeoisie, declaring their readiness to ally in the name of fighting the BJP with the Congress party, the traditional government party of the Indian bourgeoisie and the party that spearheaded the drive to make India a cheap labor haven for global capital and to forge global strategic partnership with US imperialism. The Stalinist attitude toward the struggle and strivings of the working class is exemplified by their complete abandonment of the 13 Maruti Suzuki car assembly plant workers who have been jailed for life on frame-up murder charges. Employers in India now routinely threaten workers with doing a Maruti Suzuki, that is savagely repressing a challenge to poverty wages and brutal working conditions in concert with the police, the courts, and the political establishment. Yet the Stalinists treat the jailed Maruti Suzuki workers as lepers, censoring any mention of their plight in struggle for their fear if it would disrupt their cozy relations with employers and the Congress party. In Sri Lanka, the role of the pseudo-left is no less pernicious. They lined up in support of the regime change operation that Washington joined with Delhi, orchestrated 3.5 years ago, to get rid of a right-wing president deemed too close to China, hailing the common candidate as a democratic alternative. Now that the mass struggles have erupted against the pro-austerity, pro-imperialist government they helped bring to power, they are doing everything to isolate and smother them. Above all, they seek to prevent the working class from constituting itself as an independent political force, advancing its own socialist solution to the social crisis and rallying the oppressed toilers behind it in the fight for a workers' and peasants' government. At this May Day 2018 rally, the ICFI urges workers around the world to intensify the campaign to win the freedom of the Maruti Suzuki work class struggle class war prisoners. We urge workers and youth to join with us in building a socialist anti-war movement across the reactionary state boundaries of South Asia as part of a global working class-led movement against the imperialist violence and imperialism, the source of all want and war. And last but not least, I urge all those listening today to join the ICFI. Workers around the world face fundamentally the same problems and common enemy, and will increasingly be drawn into the struggle against austerity and war that spill across boundaries and continents. But the objective unity of the working class must find conscious expression in the building of a world party of socialist revolution. The ICFI is that party.
Thank you, Comrade Vijay. It is just before 4 o'clock in the morning in Sri Lanka and India right now. But we have not only Comrade Vijay speaking to this rally today, but we have many workers in South Asia participating, as the comments section on the rally page makes clear, a testament to the power of socialist ideas and the growing radicalization of workers throughout the subcontinent. On May 1st, the Socialist Equality Party in Sri Lanka held a powerful May Day rally and meeting in defiance of a government ban that was attended by workers and youth throughout the island, including Tamil-speaking workers from the war-ravaged Jaffna Peninsula and Central Hill country plantations. Our next speaker is Peter Schwartz, the secretary of the International Committee and a leading member of the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei in Germany. Comrade Peter's writings on the political situation in Germany and Europe are followed throughout the world. He has helped develop the perspective of the ICFI in Europe and to expose the role of pseudo-left forces and organizations of the middle class, from Syriza in Greece to the NPA in France. He's been a leading voice in the fight for the Socialist United States of Europe. Welcome, Comrade Peter.
Comrades and friends, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe, the European bourgeoisie was confident that, more than 140 years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto, it would no longer be haunted by the specter of communism, that Marx would soon be forgotten and only of interest to specialized historians. A quarter century later, at Marx's 200th birthday, the opposite is the case. There's hardly a newspaper, a radio station, or a TV channel that has not published articles, interviews, documentaries, debates, or even special supplements on the subject of Marx. It has become impossible to ignore him or to reject him with a few primitive anti-communist slanders. The crisis of global capitalism, the deepening gulf between rich and poor, the resurgence of the class struggle, and the acute danger of war confirm every aspect of the analysis and perspective developed by Marx and the great Marxists of the 20th century, above all Lenin and Trotsky. The bourgeoisie and its flunkies in the editorial boards try desperately to deny this. They pay tribute to Marx as a prophet, but denounce him as a revolutionary. They pay lip service to the theoretician, but are hostile to the socialist. They refer to his critique of capitalist society, but reject its revolutionary implications. Or to use Marx's own terminology, they tolerate, to a very limited extent, the weapon of criticism, but they firmly reject the criticism by weapons. But their attempts to diffuse Marx and to transform him into a harmless icon will fail. Every day provides new proof that capitalism cannot be reformed, but must be overthrown by a socialist mass movement of the working class. The economic, social, and political mechanisms that provided some stability to European capitalism after 1945 have largely broken down. the objective conditions that made the first half of the 20th century the most violent period in history, dominated by ferocious class battles, a victorious proletarian revolution in Russia, the rise of fascism in Italy, Germany, and Spain, and two devastating world wars, are emerging again. The political and trade union organizations who claimed that capitalism can be improved in the interest of the masses by class compromise and social reform have either collapsed or moved so far to the right that they are indistinguishable from the most reactionary bourgeois parties. The same is true for the revisionist and pseudo-left organizations who have abandoned the Marxist perspective of the independent revolutionary mobilization of the working class and subordinated themselves to Stalinist, reformist, and bourgeois nationalist movements and different forms of identity politics. The most brutal attacks on the social and democratic rights of the working class over the last 2 decades are identified with the name of a British Labourite, Tony Blair, a German Social Democrat, Gerhard Schröder, and the leader of the Greek radical left, Syriza, Alexis Tsipras. The trade unions have been transformed into corporate tools who discipline and suppress the workers. The anti-working class policy pursued by the European Union on behalf of Europe's banks and corporations, and its unconditional support by the Social Democrats, trade unions, and pseudo-left parties have created conditions where the extreme right can channel social anger in a nationalist direction. As a result, the AfD became the first far-right party to enter federal parliament in Germany since World War II. The National Front has risen to become the second largest party in France. The far-right Freedom Party assumed government responsibility in Austria. The xenophobic Lega and the Five Star Movement hold a parliamentary majority in Italy, and far-right parties are in power in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. In a more fundamental sense, the rise of the far right is an expression of the decay of bourgeois democracy. The excessively high tension of the international struggle and the class struggle results in the short circuit of the dictatorship, blowing out the fuses of democracy one after the other, Leon Trotsky wrote in 1929. The same process is repeated today. The German and the French government present the European Union as an antidote to the growth of authoritarianism. In a speech to the European Parliament last month, French President Emmanuel Macron described the EU as, I quote, a unique democratic model in the world. But this is a total lie. The European Union, which has been portrayed as the guarantor of peace, democracy, and prosperity, is the driving force of austerity, militarism, xenophobia, and the building of a police state in Europe. Far from unifying the continent, it is generating the nationalist tensions that are tearing it apart. The diktats of the EU have decimated the standard of living of the Greek working class and driven youth unemployment in Southern Europe above 50%. In Eastern European countries, who have joined the EU more than 10 years ago, average wages are only a fraction of those in the West. The EU's war against refugees has cost more than 15,500 lives over the last 4 years in the Mediterranean alone. That is an average of 11 casualties every day. Both Paris and Berlin aim to transform Europe into a police state and a military grey power dominated by France and Germany, able to compete with the United States in the imperialist redivision of the world. Last month, Macron ordered airstrikes against Syria on false pretenses, without a parliamentary vote and over the opposition of most of the French population. Germany is in the midst of a massive rearmament campaign aimed at enabling the German army to do both, participate in a war against Russia and intervene in imperialist wars all over the world. The new Grand Coalition government has pledged to double military spending to 70 billion euros by 2024. This rearmament is accompanied by a continuous onslaught on social programs and workers' living standards. The AfD, which has a high percentage of former military officers, policemen and judges amongst its MPs, has been warmly embraced by the government. It is fully integrated in all the major parliamentary committees, and the government has adopted its xenophobic refugee policy, which forms the spearhead of the attacks on democratic rights. The return of militarism and the entrance of a far-right party into parliament in a country where survivors of the Nazi concentration camps are still alive has ominous historical significance. It demonstrates that the bourgeoisie will return to the most brutal forms of dictatorship if the working class, that is the vast majority of the population, does not establish its own rule, if it does not conquer power and reorganize society on the basis of social need. There is tremendous opposition against austerity and war amongst the working class and youth. This is demonstrated by the militant struggles of rail workers and students in France, the scale of strikes in Germany's metal industry and public services, the repeated eruption of general strikes in Greece, the re-emergence of worker struggles in Eastern Europe, and many other strikes and protests. The coming period will be characterized by bitter class battles, a mounting opposition to war and state repression. But these struggles require a political perspective. They can be successful only if the working class breaks with the Social Democrats, trade unions, and pseudo-left parties, unites internationally, and combines the struggle against war and austerity with the fight against the capitalist system. Only in this way can the rise of the far right be halted. The International Committee of the Fourth International is the only political tendency fighting for this perspective. We call on you all to join it and build its sections in Europe and all over the world.
Thank you, Comrade Peter. Our next speaker is also joining us from Berlin. Johannes Stern is a leading member of the SGP in Germany. He joined the Trotskyist movement in Germany in 2010 and has been on the political committee of the SGP since 2012. Johannes was in Egypt when the revolution broke out in 2011 and covered events for the WSWS. He writes extensively on political developments in Germany, as well as on Egypt and the Middle East. Welcome, Comrade Johannes.
The International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website send greetings to all workers, youth, and progressive intellectuals in the Middle East. There's hardly another region in the world where the necessity to unite the working class on a socialist perspective against imperialist exploitation and war is as sharply posed as here. In the past 25 years, the imperialist powers have been continuously at war to subdue, exploit, and essentially recolonize the resource-rich and geostrategically important region. In the course of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, entire countries have been destroyed, millions have been killed or turned into refugees. Now, the next illegal war of aggression has begun. A few days ago, numerous Iranian citizens were killed in military strikes by Israeli F-15 fighters on Syrian military bases. This is the fifth Israeli military strike against Iranian positions in Syria in recent months. It comes after US, British, and French airstrikes against Syria last month. A comprehensive war against Damascus and Tehran would not only spark a conflagration throughout the entire region, it could also trigger a direct military confrontation with the nuclear-armed powers Russia and China. The imperialist wars and rape of the Middle East mark only the first bloody stage of the new imperialist redivision of the world that was initiated after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. As far back as August 1990, when the US launched the first Gulf War, the International Committee analyzed the far-reaching historical and political implications of this process. In a statement written at the time and republished in his book, A Quarter Century of War, the US Strive for Global Hegemony, Comrade David North explained, "The end of the post-war era means the end of the post-colonial era. As it proclaims the failure of socialism, the imperialist bourgeoisie, in deeds if not yet in words, proclaims the failure of independence. The deepening crisis confronting all the major imperialist powers compels them to secure control over strategic resources and markets. Former colonies, which had achieved a degree of political independence, must be resubjugated. In its brutal assault against Iraq, imperialism is giving notice that it intends to restore the type of unrestrained domination of the backward countries that existed prior to World War II." End of quote. The greater and more violent the wars in this process, the more brazen the falsifications and lies with which they are prepared. The staged presentation by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu eclipsed even Colin Powell's false allegations about weapons of mass destruction 15 years ago, which prepared the invasion of Iraq. Netanyahu did not provide a shred of evidence for his provocative claim, or better lie, that Iran maintains a secret nuclear weapons program and is violating the denuclearization deal. The European powers are currently struggling to save the deal, as they fear that an all-out regional war would have dramatic consequences, destabilize class relations in Europe, and disrupt their own imperialist interests. But there is no doubt whose side they would take in case of an Israeli or American attack. Precisely because of the growing political and economic conflicts with Washington, the European elites want to secure their own share of the spoils when US imperialism plunders the Middle East and the world is divided up anew. The ICFI treats with contempt the various pseudo-left organizations who promote, sponsor, and legitimize the imperialist war drive as a struggle for democracy and human rights. Their support for the US-allied Islamic and Kurdish nationalist militias in Syria is a mockery of the most elementary principles of Marxism. The fight against the bourgeois regimes in Syria, Turkey, or Iran, and the building of democratic and equal societies throughout the Middle East is not the task of imperialism and its local proxies, who bring only death and destruction, but the task of an independent, revolutionary movement of the working class. Maintaining the oppression of the working class plays a central role in the calculations of the imperialist powers and their pseudo-left supporters. 7 years ago, when the revolutionary masses in Tunisia and Egypt brought down two brutal lackeys of imperialism, Ben Ali and Hosni Mubarak, the imperialist powers intervened in Libya and Syria to install pro-Western puppet regimes and divide the working class along religious and ethnic lines. In Egypt and Tunisia, at every stage of the revolution, the pseudo-left organizations played the role of subordinating the working class to one or another faction of the bourgeoisie. The so-called revolutionary socialists in Egypt went so far to hail the 2013 military coup that laid the foundation for Assisi's bloody military dictatorship as a second revolution. 5 years later, despite counter-revolution and war, the Middle East and North Africa are experiencing a revival of the class struggle. At the beginning of the year, mass protests took place in Iran, Tunisia, and Morocco. In Turkey, the employers' organization MESS was forced to increase the wages of 130,000 metal workers by 24% in order to prevent the renewed outbreak of wildcat strikes. In Israel, a one-day general strike had already paralyzed the country at the end of last year. Tens of thousands of Palestinians are currently protesting at the Israeli border for their right to return to their homes and villages from which they were forcibly evicted 70 years ago. The Israeli government, supported by Washington and the European powers, is responding with deadly force. Since the protests began in late March, at least 43 Palestinians have been shot dead and thousands seriously injured. The International Committee and the World Socialist website condemn this massacre. It's a cruel mockery that imperialism has turned people who were themselves victims of the most horrific crimes in history into persecutors. 70 years after its founding, the Zionist myth that the violent carving out of a Jewish state in Palestine would bring peace and security for the Jewish people after the horrors of the Holocaust is unraveling. While the working class in Israel is trapped in one of the most unequal societies, the only policy of the Israeli bourgeoisie is the creation of a garrison state at home and endless expansion and war abroad. There's only one way out of the maelstrom of imperialist warmongering, violence, and the general bankruptcy of the nationalist perspective in the Middle East. The unification of workers in Israel, Palestine, and throughout the region on the basis of an international socialist program. The fate of the Egyptian revolution and the devastating historical experiences of the Arab, Turkish, Kurdish, Iranian, and Jewish masses with Stalinism and the different forms of bourgeois and petty bourgeois nationalism have fully confirmed Leon Trotsky's perspective of permanent revolution. In countries with belated capitalist development, only the working class can successfully wage the struggle for democracy and against imperialism. And this struggle can only be achieved through the overthrow of the capitalist system as part of the world socialist revolution. The objective conditions for the proletarian revolution have ripened in the Middle East for many years. The central historical task, which is becoming ever more urgent in the face of the danger of another devastating war, is the resolution of the crisis of revolutionary leadership. We appeal to all our listeners and readers from the region to join the International Committee and the Fourth International and actively build socialist equality parties and chapters of the IYSSE in your countries.
Thank you, Comrade Johannes. I would like to take a moment to thank everyone listening who has donated to the World Socialist website, including many of you who made significant contributions when registering for this May Day rally. Your support has made possible not only this rally, but helps finance the daily work of the World Socialist website, including our coverage of workers' struggles all over the world. If you have not donated, please make a contribution by clicking on the link on the sidebar of the rally page at wsws.org/Mayday. If you're a regular reader of the World Socialist website, make the decision to become a WSWS supporter by signing up for a monthly contribution. The World Socialist website is your publication. It is the voice of the working class. By setting up a monthly donation, you are helping with every dollar for us to reach more workers, cover more struggles, and build the readership of the World Socialist website. Our next speaker is Jerry White, joining us here in Detroit, Michigan. Jerry has been a member of the Socialist Equality Party and its predecessor, the Workers' League, since 1979. He has written extensively on the struggles of the American working class, including most recently the rebellion of auto workers in 2015, as well as leading the World Socialist website's demand for an investigation into the October 2017 death of Jacoby Hennings, a 21-year-old part-time temporary auto worker at Ford's Woodhaven stamping plant just south of Detroit. In recent months, Comrade Jerry has traveled to West Virginia and Oklahoma to cover and provide political leadership to the revolt of teachers against the attack on public education. Welcome, Comrade Jerry.
As we celebrate May Day and the bicentenary of the birth of Karl Marx, the reemergence of class conflict throughout the world, and in particular in the United States, confirms that the class struggle is indeed the driving force of historical development. The history of all hitherto existing society, Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1847, is the history of class struggles. The distinct feature of capitalism, they wrote, is that it simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. 10 years after the global financial crash in the summer of 2008, the class struggle is resurging around the world. Since the beginning of the year, there have been upheavals in Tunisia, Iran, and Greece, a wave of industrial strikes in Germany, working class opposition against Macron, the president of the rich, in France, and class battles in India, Sri Lanka, and South Korea. In the United States, statewide strikes by teachers in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona have been part of a worldwide revolt by educators spanning Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Over the last decade, the resistance of workers to capitalist exploitation was suppressed by the pro-capitalist unions and social democratic, Stalinist, and pseudo-left parties. Between 2008 and 2017, there were only 129 work stoppages involving 1,000 or more workers in the United States, the lowest 10-year period since the Bureau of Labor Statistics began recording strikes in 1947. By contrast, between 1968 and 1977, there were 3,238 major strikes, or 25 times more than the last decade. The suppression of the class struggle by the unions allowed the ruling class to carry out a historic redistribution of wealth from the bottom to the top. Under Obama, the financial speculators who crashed the economy were bailed out, and the stock markets reinflated through a regime of virtually free credit, which depended on preventing any rise in, quote, inflation, the code word for increasing wages. The ruling class's decade-long program of social counter-revolution escalated with the gutting of health care and pensions, resulting in a decline in life expectancy for older workers, while the young generation was condemned to low-wage, temporary jobs and crushing college debts. Despite the long efforts to deny the existence of the class struggle in the land of so-called unlimited opportunity, the division of American society into two hostile camps has never been clearer. Just 3 billionaires, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 160 million people in America. The top 1% of American households own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. After Trump's tax cut, corporations are sitting on a cash hoard of more than $2 trillion, and companies like Apple are spending record amounts on dividends and stock buybacks to further enrich investors and top executives. The contending factions of the American political establishment are engaged in bitter infighting over geopolitical and military policy, with the corporate media and the Democrats speaking for the military intelligence agencies and hurling accusations of sexual misconduct and Russian collusion at Trump to shift them even further to the right, including into a direct military confrontation with Russia. In an effort to direct internal social tensions outward, the media and the Democrats are blaming the Russians for sowing divisions in America, as if without Putin and the Russians, America would be a thoroughly contented society. The American working class, however, is consumed with entirely different concerns over plummeting wages, austerity, social inequality, mass deportations, and the danger of war and dictatorship. Over the last 2 months, statewide strikes by teachers have spread across West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona, and strikes and protests have hit or are continuing to spread in Colorado, New Jersey, Florida, the Carolinas, and the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. As one teacher in Oklahoma protesting in front of the state capitol for increased school funding for her children told the WSWS, "I didn't see Putin or any other Russians inside the state capitol." It is significant that teachers have been in the forefront of this resurgence of the class struggle. They deeply identify with the egalitarian principles of public education, which are incompatible with the staggering levels of inequality, and are intimately aware of the impact of bipartisan funding cuts and the growth of poverty and other social ills like the opioid epidemic on their school children. Various fake left apologists of the unions have attempted to claim that the teacher strikes have given a new breath of fresh air to the unions. But the strikes were not initiated by the unions, which opposed them and did everything to shut them down once they erupted. Instead, the struggles were initiated by rank-and-file teachers using social media who rebelled against the unions and their collusion with the austerity measures imposed by Democrats and Republicans alike. This prompted a worried comment from the New York Times about teachers using social media to, quote, organize and act outside the usual parameters of traditional unionism. Now, no position of the International Committee of the Fourth International has been more bitterly attacked by the pseudo-left than its exposure of the right-wing role and anti-working class character of the unions. Yet our analysis of the transformation of the unions into direct agencies of the corporations and the capitalist state is the most powerful confirmation of the Marxist method. The ICFI was alone in uncovering the historical significance of the global integration of capitalist production in the late 80s and 90s. Globalization, we explained, had fatally undermined the Stalinist program of socialism in one country in the USSR and the nationalist programs that formed the foundation of all the unions and labor parties. The next period of working class radicalization, the ICFI insisted, would take the form of a rebellion against these nationalist and pro-capitalist organizations. Workers would be more and more compelled to coordinate their struggles against the global corporations on the basis of an international and socialist perspective, which the ICFI alone embodies. When addressing the representatives of the ruling elite, the union officials openly boast that their chief function is to prevent strikes and enforce the dictates of the employers in the state. This was spelled out earlier this year in the opening argument by union lawyers before the Supreme Court in the case of Janus versus AFSCME. The sanctioning of the unions by the state and the guarantee of their financial security, the union attorney argued, was a trade-off for, quote, no strikes. If the court ruled against the unions collecting agency fees from public employees who are not members, the lawyer warned, quote, you can raise an untold specter of labor unrest throughout the country. The teachers' revolt is a sign of what is to come. In every section of the working class, there is a mood of rebellion. The call by the ICFI for workers to form new organizations of struggle, independent of the corporatist unions and controlled by the rank and file, has won powerful support. In the United States, an incipient rebellion is brewing against the United Auto Workers Union, whose corrupt relations with the auto companies and role as a cheap labor contractor was highlighted in the tragic and still unexplained death 6 months ago of Jacoby Hennings, the 21-year-old temporary part-time worker at a Detroit area Ford plant. But every class struggle is a political struggle. Marx and Engels insisted in the Communist Manifesto. That is, every struggle of the working class for its rights, whether for decent wages, public education, against war and state repression, poses the necessity of the working class being organized as an independent political force and taking political power in its own hands so it can reorganize economic and political life to meet society's needs. Spontaneous struggles, no matter how militant, cannot solve the crisis of revolutionary leadership or automatically clarify the political tasks of the working class. A party based on the most advanced revolutionary theory and gathering within its ranks the most politically advanced sections of workers and youth must bring socialist consciousness into the struggles of the working class. Our politics is not conjunctural, but of a principled character, Leon Trotsky wrote in 1940. For us, the primary concern of every political campaign is that it guide workers from the particular question to the general, that it teach them the nature of modern society and the character of its fundamental forces. Now, anti-Marxists around the world have long claimed that the American working class was too backward for socialism. The agency for social change, these demoralized skeptics insisted, are the privileged sections of minorities and women who, far from seeking the overthrow of capitalism, only want to join the ranks of the oppressors. In contrast, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement, has always insisted that the American working class, driven into struggle by the historic breakdown of American and world capitalism, would turn to Marxism to understand its social position and historic tasks and make a monumental contribution to the world socialist revolution. The development of the class struggle in the United States is transforming world politics. The awakening of this sleeping giant, the American proletariat, will inspire struggles all over the world, undermining the most reactionary force on the planet, American imperialism, and workers in the United States will join their class brothers and sisters internationally in the greatest emancipatory struggle the world has ever known, following the clarion call of the Communist Manifesto. Workers of the world unite. The proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains. They have the world to win.
Thank you, Comrade Jerry. The initiative of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States has taken for the call for formation of rank-and-file committees has won a powerful response among teachers and other sections of the working class, which have gone through bitter experiences and learned lessons about the nature of these organizations. We have, in fact, listening today, many teachers, auto workers, and other workers in the United States who have gone through these experiences. We urge you to take steps now to form independent organizations to prepare a united struggle. However, as Jerry insisted, the most critical issue is the building of a political leadership, a socialist leadership. To all workers in the U.S. and internationally, I urge you to make the decision today to join the Socialist Equality Party. Write to us at sep@socialistequality.com or click the link on the sidebar of the rally page. Our next speaker is Andre Damon. Andre has been a member of the Socialist Equality Party since 2006. He has written extensively for the World Socialist website on economics, social inequality, and geopolitics. Beginning in 2017, Comrade Andre has focused his reporting on Google's censorship of left-wing, anti-war, and progressive websites as part of a broader move to censor the internet by major technology companies. Welcome, Comrade Andre.
1 year ago, the World Socialist website held its annual commemoration of May Day during its most successful period in its 19-year history. Over the previous year, our site had received nearly 10 million visits. The month before, over 900,000 individual users visited the WSWS, reflecting a 25% increase in just 4 months. Within a matter of days, we would go on to publish our first video that received over 1 million views. The reports to that year's May Day celebration reflected this growth. Without succumbing to immodesty, we noted, the International Committee and its sections have every right in this centennial year of the Russian Revolution to look to the future with confidence. The influence of the World Socialist website, the voice of the International Committee, is growing rapidly. This sober assessment of the mounting influence of the WSWS, reflecting the growth of socialist sentiment within the working class, was mirrored in the proverbial smoke-filled rooms in which the leading representatives of the financial oligarchy conduct their deliberations. Alarmed by the growth of socialist sentiment, the ruling class determined to take action. Facing a restive working class, hostile to war and social inequality, and increasingly propelled into action after a decade of wage cuts and social austerity, the strategists of the ruling class determined that their only hope in stemming the tide of social opposition was to go after what every police regime in history believed was its source: critical news outlets. The source of information rebellions are outlets distributing bogus stories, said one prominent advocate of this view. Silence the guns, and the barrage will end. These individuals, in other words, adopted views shared by every ruling class in history that had been overthrown by revolution, that popular social grievances can be resolved with police batons. As we celebrated May Day, we did not know that less than 1 week before, Google had taken the first step in what would subsequently lead to a historic transformation of the major American technology companies. From the disseminators of information, they would be transformed into its censors. That giant step was announced in a discreetly worded blog post claiming Google had taken measures to improve the search system in order to help people find what they were looking for. These measures would be taken, as the company subsequently told the reporter, in such a way as not to reflect political bias. Over the next year, all of these pretensions fell away. Rather than seeking to help people find what they were looking for, Google's aim was the literal opposite. As Congressman Adam Schiff said in a congressional hearing, Google has the societal obligation to change the fact that what ends up percolating to the top of our feeds tends to be things we were looking for. And this is exactly what Google did. The company carried out a far-reaching revision of the way it evaluated every one of its millions of search terms, severing connections between popular topics such as inequality, war, democratic rights, and socialism, and leading left-wing websites. In both the empirical and political sense, the main target of this censorship was the World Socialist website. Within 3 months of Google's announcement, every single one of the WSWS's top 45 search terms no longer linked users to the site. As a result, the World Socialist website's search traffic from Google fell by more than 3/4, far more than any of the numerous other left-wing, anti-war, and progressive websites affected by the company's measures. The targeting of the World Socialist website was a recognition, in the negative, of the fact that it represents the most coherent expression of the social interests of the working class and the political strategy of proletarian revolution, posing an existential threat to the capitalist class. And, true to its historic mission, the World Socialist website, alone among all the sites that had been gagged, launched a struggle against this censorship. On August 25th, the World Socialist website published an open letter declaring that Google is manipulating its internet searches to restrict public awareness of and access to socialist, anti-war, and left-wing websites, adding that censorship on this scale is political blacklisting. We expose the alliance of the technology monopolies with the US military and intelligence apparatus, revealing that Google and Facebook are acting as the agents of the state in its effort to destroy the First Amendment. But rather than being the exception, Google has set the pattern for Facebook, Twitter, and other technology companies. In announcing its plans to censor fake news, Facebook made clear that it was proceeding exactly as the World Socialist website had alleged. Since stifling the public discourse is a sensitive issue, the company said, it would significantly reduce the distribution of targeted content by showing it lower in the news feed without notifying users they were being censored. In other words, every word of the World Socialist website's open letter had been confirmed. The turn to censorship, today as ever, is an act of fear and desperation, a recognition that the ruling elite not only has nothing to offer society, but sees itself surrounded and besieged by the great mass of the population. But censorship is an effort to bar the stable doors after the horse has bolted. No bankrupt social order has ever succeeded in preserving itself through police means. In fact, there has never been so wide an audience for revolutionary socialist politics. Over the past quarter century, the ranks of the international working class have swelled with the entry of fresh battalions from India, China, Latin America, and the Middle East. Like never before in human history, the masses are interconnected not only by the productive process, but by the World Wide Web, which celebrated its 29th anniversary this year under conditions when more than half the population is connected to the internet, and through it, the great achievements of human culture, at the forefront of which stands the scientific socialist tradition, brought into the world 200 years ago with the birth of Karl Marx. The World Socialist website, the first genuinely international newspaper in the history of the socialist movement, now in its 20th year of continuous publication, is itself the expression of both the growing objective strength of the international working class and its interconnectedness. We hold no illusions. The ruling elite will pay any price, including attempting to bring down the vast edifice of international communications that underpins the world economy in an effort to stifle the political awakening of the masses. But let them do their worst. We will do our best. 80 years ago, in announcing the formation of the Fourth International amid the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Bolsheviks by Stalin's murderers, Leon Trotsky declared, "The hangmen think in their obtuseness and cynicism that it is possible to frighten us. They err. Under blows we will become stronger. The bestial politics of Stalin are only the politics of despair. It is possible to kill individual soldiers of our army, but not to frighten them. Friends, we repeat again in this day of celebration, it is not possible to frighten us." Likewise today, we declare, it is not possible to censor us. Despite the most draconian censorship regime in the history of the internet, the readership of the World Socialist website is again growing as workers and youth enter into struggle. The long-awaited upsurge of the working class has already begun. From rail workers in France, to airline workers in Germany, to the teachers of America and the masses of North Africa, a wave of working-class militancy is sweeping the globe. What the forces of reaction fear most is exactly what is on the agenda, the intersection of this upsurge of the masses with this conscious struggle for Marxism. As Marx to the bicentenary of whose birth we dedicate this celebration, proclaimed, "Theory becomes a material force when it grips the masses." Comrades, it is with confidence that the proud legacy of Karl Marx will grip the masses, that the International Committee embarks upon the 20th year of the publication of the World Socialist website, and with it, to a new era of socialist revolution.
Thank you, Comrade Andre. But say that this rally itself expresses the power of the internet, its revolutionary significance, its ability to unite workers all over the world in a common struggle, as well as the role specifically of the World Socialist website. This is an extraordinary meeting. From the comments that we have so far, we have participants listening right now from Turkey, the United States, Germany, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Sri Lanka, Costa Rica, France, India, Scotland, Portugal, South Korea, Canada, Brazil, Romania, Australia, Spain, Morocco, and China. It is a global event connected by the technology of the internet and by the political perspective of the International Committee of the Fourth International. And of course, it is this that the ruling class is terrified, the prospect of the growth of an international socialist movement of the working class. As Andre mentioned, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the founding of the World Socialist website, a major milestone in the history of the international socialist and workers' movement. The WSWS was the first and remains the only daily socialist and Marxist internet publication. When the WSWS was launched 20 years ago, we noted the revolutionary significance of the internet, and we warned that when the ruling class became aware of the power of this technology to coordinate and develop the class struggle, there would be efforts to constrain it. Of course, this is what is taking place. We pledge to redouble our efforts to expose and combat the ruling class's conspiracy of censorship, to read what we have written, and to sign up to become active in this fight against censorship. Visit wsws.org/censorship. Our next speaker is Genevieve Lee. Genevieve is a leading member of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality in the United States. She joined the Socialist Equality Party in 2016 and the International Youth and Students for Social Equality National Committee in the United States the same year. She has been a regular writer for the World Socialist website, covering the social crisis in the United States, the conditions facing immigrant workers, and many other topics. She joins us here in Detroit. Welcome, Comrade Genevieve.
The first half of this year has been characterized by an upsurge of working class struggles all over the world. Against austerity in Iran, by technology workers in China, a wave of strikes and rebellions by teachers and lecturers in Nigeria, Kenya, Tunisia, Mexico, and all across the US. In all of these struggles, young workers and students have played an active role. In Iran, unemployed youth predominated the demonstrations in rural towns. Students in the US organized demonstrations in West Virginia and Oklahoma in support of their teachers. And over 1 million young people in the US and around the world held a massive nationally coordinated demonstration against school violence. And while the Democratic Party in the US fought tooth and nail to make the protests about gun control reform, we know that much broader issues drew 1 million youth to the streets. There is a widespread sense among these young people that the ease and frequency with which they are massacred in American schools is symptomatic of the indifference and contempt with which the country's ruling oligarchy regards their lives. A new generation of the working class is becoming politicized, and in a time unlike any in history. Those born at the turn of the century have lived their entire lives watching imperialist powers wage wars of aggression in every corner of the globe. For some of the youth engaged in struggle, the war in Afghanistan has been raging longer than they've been alive. They have come of age as drone assassinations became institutionalized by the Obama administration. Young people in the Middle East have seen their societies ravaged by imperialist violence, while those in the US have had their friends and family members sent off to kill or to be killed to advance the aims of the American ruling class for world conquest. An 18-year-old today was 8 years old when the global financial crash ushered in a tidal wave of social distress throughout the world. with the major capitalist powers, led by the US under the Obama administration, funneling trillions of dollars into Wall Street to bail out the banks. US youth are entering into political life under the presidency of Donald Trump, the most right-wing administration in US history. Far-right governments are on the rise throughout Europe. The first political experiences of this generation have been the scenes of these governments deporting immigrants, attacking workers, slashing funding to education, all with the complicity of social democratic and labor parties and the Democratic Party in the US. This generation has been born into conditions created by 40 years of social counter-revolution against the working class, and the effects have been devastating. Almost half of all youth in the millennial generation have no money in savings. We can't afford healthcare, homes, or an education. Young people make up an estimated 70 million out of the 200 million people out of work around the world. Children all over the world lack basic necessities of life. Approximately 3.1 million children die of hunger each year. Among students, homelessness and hunger are rampant, with many youth having to make a choice between paying for school or having a home. In the US, this crisis has manifested itself most graphically in a deadly drug epidemic. In just 2 years, from 2014 to 2016, the rate at which 25 to 34-year-olds died rose by 19%, due overwhelmingly to opioid use. While trillions is spent on war and handed out to corporations and the rich, working-class youth enter into schools starved of resources, with teachers who are forced to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. Teachers in Oklahoma during the strike posted photos of destroyed textbooks. In Flint, Michigan, there's a public high school which has gone an entire year with dozens of classes with no teachers at all. The same school was instead flooded with security officers and metal detectors. When these students leave high school, they have few options: attend college and become saddled with thousands of dollars of debt, join the military and become cannon fodder for the wars of the ruling class, or enter the workforce, where wages have stagnated and most young people need 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. This is the future the capitalist system offers youth in 2018. Working class youth are entering into struggle. There's a vast reservoir of anger and hostility to the current system, to the state of the world, to oppression, war, societal violence, and inequality. There's little need to explain to young people that there is something deeply wrong with society. They understand very well the depths of the social crisis. They are living it. When we talk to young people at protests and at workplaces and on campuses, they speak about revolution. Some call themselves socialists. Indeed, in the US, the center of world imperialism, more young people now identify with socialism rather than capitalism. This generation also has more access to technology, information, knowledge than any time in human history. The internet, which is now used by millions of youth throughout the globe, has given this generation access to almost endless library of information. Workers all over the world can now see each other's conditions firsthand. Crimes of the state, such as police killings, can be broadcast outside of the confines of bourgeois media. And as we have seen with the wave of teacher rebellions, workers can use this technology to organize outside of the framework of the corporatist media. But what is most crucially absent from these struggles is a political perspective and a knowledge of the history of the socialist movement. We were told by the unions in the teachers' strike that education is not a political issue. The youth in March for Our Lives were fed the same line. In one breath, they told us no politics, and the next they say change will be made at the ballot box. But we know exactly what no politics means. It means the domination of the present politics. It means the domination of the politics of the ruling class. Lenin, in his day, called them uplifters, those liberals and academics who he said are believers in law-abiding progress without a political struggle. And he waged a relentless fight against them. As we can see, these methods are well worn. Leon Trotsky delivered to young people in the Soviet Union in 1924, on May Day, in fact, where he addressed this question directly. He said, "The bourgeoisie carries out a division of labor. Politics is in its charge. The workers and peasants in the army are cannon fodder, slaves to the machines of destruction. And it is exactly the same so far as the younger generation is concerned. The young workers and peasants, that is. Politics fills the air. It is not possible to live outside of politics, without politics, any more than one can live without air. He went on, but the bourgeoisie cannot reveal its political face to young people. It cannot say, there you are, the 12 or 13-year-old son of a worker. You have been born into a world in order that, after serving an apprenticeship to some trade, you may go into a factory and there, to the end of your days, create with your sweat, blood, and marrow surplus value for the lords of life, the bourgeoisie, who, from this surplus value, will create its bourgeois culture, its luxury, art, and learning for its children. The bourgeoisie cannot openly expound such politics to young workers. It puts over its politics by way of circumlocution and allegories, imperceptibility or half-perceptibility, through its schools, its churches, its press. And this work of the imperceptible bourgeois education of young people, or rather, the education of young workers and peasants in the interests of the bourgeois state, is concealed behind the slogan, "The younger generation is outside politics," end quote. Such slogans are used to deceive and disorient. The ruling class of today wants nothing more than to keep young people from becoming political, and above all, from turning to the working class, from fighting for the political mobilization of the working class against the capitalist system. And they want to cut young people off from knowledge of history of the working class struggle, expressed consciously in the history of the Marxist movement. They want to drown young people in the reactionary, subjective, idealist, and irrational politics of race and gender identity, which permeates schools and universities. Theoretical tendencies associated with the Frankfurt School, the varieties of postmodernism, neo-anarchism, and identity politics are all rooted in their rejection of Marxism and the revolutionary role of the working class. The fight to build a socialist movement of the working class today requires a struggle to educate a new generation of students and working class youth in the history and principles of Marxism and the Fourth International. Through this struggle, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality will win to its banner working class youth and the best layers of the middle class who adopt the standpoint of the working class in the struggle for socialism. The most critical task ahead for the revolutionary youth around the world is to understand their struggles as political struggles. We must study politics. For millions of workers and young people seeking to create a society based on peace, equality, and genuine democracy, this must be made our most pressing task. We must reject bourgeois politics and fight for revolutionary politics, for an independent political strategy of the working class. The IOSSC calls for all young people participating in this rally today to take up the fight for socialism and to join the IOSSC.
Thank you, Comrade Genevieve. All those listening today who would like to respond to that call by joining the IYSSC can do so by visiting the IYSSC website at iyssc.com. Our next speaker is Comrade Nick Beams, who's speaking today from Sydney, Australia. Comrade Beams is a founding and leading member of the SEP in Australia. He is an expert in Marxist political economy and the author of countless articles on the subject published on the World Socialist website. Nick also delivered the lecture World War and Revolution 1914 to 1917 as part of the ICFI's series of lectures marking the centenary of the Russian Revolution last year. Welcome, Comrade Nick.
Comrades and friends, as we commemorate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, the founder of scientific socialism, I would like to present my remarks on the state of the capitalist world economy within the framework of the analysis he developed. In his postface to the second edition of his magnum opus, Das Kapital, Marx quoted a Russian reviewer of the first edition who had summed up his materialist method. The one thing, this reviewer wrote, which is important for Marx, is to find the law of the phenomena with whose investigation he is concerned. Marx, he wrote, had set himself the task of investigating the capitalist economic order from this point of view in a strictly scientific manner. The value of such a method of inquiry, he concluded, lies in the illumination of the special laws that regulate the origin, existence, development, and death of a given social organism and its replacement by another, higher one. This means that in assessing the present stage of development of the global capitalist economy, we have to proceed not from some superficial examination of this or that economic statistic, but from an historical materialist analysis of the situation. To illustrate what I mean, let me point by way of contrast to the method by which bourgeois economists and pundits and their innumerable think tanks and academic institutions go about this task. 10 years ago, the world financial system, and following it, the world economy, plunged into the deepest crisis it had experienced since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Not only was such an event completely unanticipated, it had been preceded by the celebration of what was known as the Great Moderation, a period of continuous economic growth, the best since the post-war boom, low inflation, low interest rates, and the spread of the benefits of free market capitalism to so-called emerging markets. In other words, through an uncritical acceptance of the facts at a given moment, they had concluded that all was really for the best in the best of all possible worlds. But then the entire order collapsed very much in the way that Marx had described, that is, in the way that the law of gravity asserts itself when a house falls about our ears. Proceeding by the same blind method which had led them to being completely caught by surprise, they then concluded that in order to save the system, they had to place trillions of dollars at the disposal of the very banks and financial institutions whose activities had provoked the crisis. A decade on, what is the situation? In its latest World Economic Outlook, the International Monetary Fund forecast that the world economy would experience the best 2 years of growth since the financial crisis. But in making this assessment, it was forced to take note of what it called a jarring sound in the eruption of the most significant trade war conflicts since those of the 1930s, which preceded and contributed to the outbreak of World War II. As the managing director of the IMF noted, the world economy was under threat of being torn apart by these conflicts. The fund's chief economist pointed to the paradoxical situation that major economies were flirting with trade war at a time of economic expansion, threatening the very trade and investment on which that expansion depended. At the same time, the IMF pointed to the growth of debt. It is now 40% higher than in 2007-2008, standing at $164 trillion, a clear indication that the tendencies which produced the financial meltdown have not only not been overcome, but are developing once again stronger than ever. This week, more than 1,000 economists, including 14 Nobel laureates, wrote an open letter to Trump warning that his trade war measures threaten to repeat the mistake of the 1930s when the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act played a central role in plunging the world into the Great Depression. But for bourgeois economists, the prospect of trade war tearing the world economy apart is some kind of external factor, unrelated to the basic functioning of capitalism, a mistake which can be corrected if only reason and rationality prevail. The fundamental flaw in such analysis is that the capitalist economy does not function according to these precepts. It is driven, as Marx demonstrated, by the struggle waged by privately owned corporations, first of all to extract surplus value from the labour of the world's producers, the international working class, and then to appropriate it through a relentless, never-ending, dog-eat-dog struggle for markets, profits, and financial gains. In order to understand the present economic situation, and having done so, advance a perspective for the working class, let us turn to the central foundation of Marx's materialist analysis. He explained that the essential contradiction of the capitalist mode of production was that between the growth of the productive forces which it promoted and the social relations based on the private ownership of the means of production and wage labour. It was this contradiction which revealed that capitalism was not a historically eternal system, but one destined to be overthrown by the gravedigger it created in the form of the working class. Consider the historical development of the capitalist economy from this point of view. The spread of capitalist social relations in the 19th century and the formation of the modern-day system of nation-states gave a mighty impulse to the development of the productive forces. But that very growth came into conflict with the nation-state system within which it had hitherto developed, a contradiction which exploded in August 1914 with the eruption of World War I. But the same contradictions which had given rise to the war also produced the conditions for world socialist revolution, which found its initial expression in the Russian Revolution of October 1917. Due to the betrayals of the leaderships of the working class, first the Social Democratic and Labour parties, and then the counter-revolutionary Stalinist bureaucracy, which developed in the first workers' state, the bourgeoisie was able to remain in the saddle. But the economic contradictions that had produced the war did not abate. Rather, they intensified, leading to the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II. In the aftermath of the war, the support provided by the leaderships of the working class to the capitalist order meant that the bourgeoisie was able to hold on to power and then initiate economic measures that resulted in the post-war capitalist boom. But contrary to the conventional wisdom of the time, that capitalism could be managed and the profit system reconciled with democracy and rising living standards, the post-war economic order lasted barely 3 decades. The world was rent by a series of economic crises in the period 1968 to 75, which again produced a revolutionary upsurge of the working class, beginning with the May-June 1968 general strike in France, the largest and most extended in history. The betrayal of that upsurge enabled the bourgeoisie to carry out a major restructuring of the global economy based on a continuous drive against the living standards of the working class and the globalization of production, in particular after the liquidation of the Soviet Union and the restoration of capitalism in China, as capital sought to exploit cheaper sources of labour. But the contradictions of capitalism between the global economy and the nation-state system, between socialised production and the private appropriation of profit, between the accumulation of fabulous wealth in the hands of a capitalist oligarchy at the expense of the mass of the working population, have intensified, assuming the form of financial crises, the spectre of economic depression, the eruption of trade war, and the impending danger of a third world war. But at the same time, these contradictions are producing the objective conditions for world socialist revolution, now manifesting themselves above all in a new upsurge of the international working class, vastly expanded by economic globalization following decades of suppression of the class struggle. On this May Day, therefore, the key question for the international working class is first of all to consciously grasp this objective reality, the economic logic of events, and then to act upon that comprehension by building the necessary revolutionary leadership, the International Committee of the Fourth International, to lead the coming struggle for power to establish international socialism.
Thank you, Comrade Nick. Our next speaker also joins us from Australia. Comrade James Cogan joined the Australian section of the Trotskyist movement in 1991. Since the launch of the World Socialist website, he has written regularly on political and social developments in Australia and Asia, as well as on the U.S.-led wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was elected Socialist Equality Party Assistant National Secretary in 2012 and National Secretary of the SEP in Australia in 2015. Welcome, Comrade James.
Well, comrades and friends, over the past year, the prospect of a war on the Korean Peninsula involving nuclear weapons and inflicting millions of casualties has existed as a terrible but all too real possibility. We've witnessed the US President Donald Trump standing before the United Nations General Assembly and threatening to, quote, totally destroy the isolated state of North Korea on the pretext it has assembled a small nuclear arsenal. The North Korean regime responded with threats that it could retaliate by firing nuclear missiles at West Coast American cities or at Japan. Talks are now scheduled to be held in the coming weeks between Trump and North Korean head Kim Jong-un. However, any conception that such talks will result in, quote, peace for our time are just as naive as such claims in 1938 when British and German imperialism negotiated the Nazi annexation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Like Hitler's regime, US imperialism has signalled that it will accept only complete submission to its demands, which essentially amount to North Korea being transformed into a US client state on China's northern border. If the Pyongyang regime refuses, the prospect of war will return with renewed intensity. The situation on the Korean Peninsula is only one particularly acute expression of the tremendous threat posed to the international working class by the ever-sharpening strategic, economic, and military competition and resulting tensions between the United States and China. US imperialism, acting in the interests of the Wall Street banks and conglomerates, is not prepared to accept its dominance in the economically crucial Asia-Indo-Pacific region being supplanted by the Chinese capitalist state that has developed over the past 3 decades, and China emerging as a rival centre of global power. Through the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, a web of alliances and partnerships has been forged by the US, centrally involving its main regional imperialist allies, Japan and Australia, to apply military pressure against China and undermine its attempts to forge greater influence in the region. The inexorable drive toward war was made explicit in the new US National Defense Strategy adopted by the Trump administration in January 2018. The document bluntly accused China of seeking, quote, Indo-Pacific regional hegemony in the near term and displacement of the United States to achieve global preeminence in the future. It asserts that the United States must, quote, prioritize preparedness for war, including through a massive upgrading of its nuclear arsenal, which is already capable of destroying the entire planet several times over. As before World War I and World War II, what is unfolding is a struggle between rival great powers for domination over markets, resources, spheres of influence, and above all, share of global profit. It arises not out of the irrationality of political leaders, but out of the irrationality of the division of the globally integrated economy into competing capitalist states, and the irrationality of vast social production set in motion by the collective labour power of billions of workers being subordinated to the generation of private profit for the capitalist handful. By flipping North Korea into its sphere of influence, the United States and its allies are setting to weaken China and intensify pressure upon it. Far from any agreement on the Korean Peninsula lessening the danger of war between the United States and China, it will serve only to increase it. It is just one of a range of provocations underway against Beijing, which risks triggering open conflict. Others include the rejection of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, the development of the de facto anti-China quadrilateral alliance between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, provocative discussion on establishing closer US and Japanese military ties with Taiwan, the hysterical campaign in Australia and New Zealand, and increasingly in the United States, against alleged, quote, Chinese interference and spying, the blocking of Chinese investment in various countries on purported national security grounds, and as Comrade Nick Beams just reviewed, moves towards wholesale trade war focused on undermining major Chinese-based corporations. This May Day, we are commemorating 200 years since the birth of Karl Marx and his development of philosophic and historical materialism, the basis of our scientific, socialist, and internationalist perspective. Our response to the danger of world war flows from that perspective. There is only one social force that can prevent war, and that is the international working class, the sole revolutionary class which has re-entered mass social struggle. War cannot be prevented by pacifist appeals to the ruling classes, let alone to the impotent United Nations. It will certainly not be prevented by the sordid diplomatic intrigues of US imperialism, other powers, or the Chinese state. What is necessary is the unification of the working class into a mass international anti-war movement under the banner of World Socialist Revolution, the perspective fought for only by the Trotskyist movement. The crucial task, which cannot be delayed, is the establishment of sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International across the Indo-Pacific region. In New Zealand and the Pacific Island states, across Southeast Asia, in Taiwan and Hong Kong, in Korea, Japan, and of course China, and in India, Pakistan, and all the South Asian countries. The fight to build the Fourth International and unify the international working class will require a conscious fight against the efforts of the ruling classes of all countries to divide workers and tie them to decaying capitalism through nationalism, religious sectarianism, and racism. It will require creative and determined efforts to overcome the efforts to censor and suppress the spread of socialist ideas. It is not only American imperialism and its allies that are working with the collaboration of the internet conglomerates to censor working class opposition and the World Socialist website in particular. The Chinese capitalist regime, which emerged out of the bureaucratic Maoist-Stalinist apparatus that betrayed the Chinese Revolution, is so fearful of renewed socialist struggle by the Chinese workers that it is now using its firewall systems to try to block access to the World Socialist website on mainland China. 80 years ago, in the founding document of the Fourth International, Leon Trotsky wrote that its cadre were, quote, pledges for the future. Outside these cadre, he continued, there does not exist a single revolutionary current on this planet really meriting the name. The strategic experiences of the past 80 years have proven the truth of those words. The International Committee of the Fourth International is the only revolutionary movement. To all supporters of the ICFI and readers of the World Socialist website in the Indo-Pacific region, I urge you to make May Day 2018 the day you commit yourself to joining its ranks. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade James. Our next speaker is Comrade Chris Marsden, joining us from England. Comrade Chris has played a leading and critical role in the defense of the perspective of Trotskyism over many decades, including in the split with the Workers' Revolutionary Party in 1985-86. His many articles on the World Socialist website have analyzed developments in Britain, from the character of Brexit to the politics of Corbyn and his pseudo-left supporters. Welcome, Comrade Chris.
Comrades, brothers and sisters, Marx repudiated the central premise of reformism when drawing the fundamental lessons from the Paris Commune of 1871. The first attempt by the working class to take power into its own hands ended in the slaughter of up to 20,000 communards. Marx concluded from this that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The modern state, he said, functioned as the national power of capital over labour, a public force organised for social enslavement, and an engine of class despotism. The working class must overthrow the bourgeois state and establish its own state, tasked with the, quote, expropriation of the expropriators. Now, the history of the revolutionary socialist movement is one of implacable hostility to the advocates of reformism, of the constant exposure of their pretensions and falsehoods to break their influence over the working class. In 1938, Leon Trotsky gave a speech on the founding of the Fourth International, in which he declared, "Our aim is the full material and spiritual liberation of the toilers and exploited through the socialist revolution. Nobody will prepare it and nobody will guide it but ourselves." He contrasted the Fourth International with the old internationals, which he said were rotten through and through. The great events which rush upon mankind will not leave of these outlived organisations one stone on another. That prediction is now being realised. The Stalinist parties are either husks, or in the case of China, the new organising nexus of the bourgeoisie. The social democratic parties of Europe, which once had advocated a reformist road to socialism, are going the same way. Today, the average share of their vote in Western European countries is just 22%. The German SPD, which is supported by less than a fifth of the electorate, is in a second grand coalition propping up the right-wing CDU. But only another 5 EU states, Malta, Portugal, Romania, Sweden and Slovakia, have social democrats in government. Some parties, such as France's Socialist Party, have suffered a collapse to single-figure support, including Greece, which gave the name PASOKification to this phenomena. The Blairite think tank, Prospect, proclaims recently the social democracy, the most influential force in European politics for decades, is dying. Well, they should know, because the party they dubbed New Labour was in the vanguard of the political shift to a nakedly pro-business, pro-privatisation, pro-austerity and pro-war agenda that has ended in electoral meltdown. The working class, particularly the younger generation, has abandoned the old parties in disgust as to what they have done. Moreover, the broad left parties that were meant to supposedly replace these despised formations have themselves been discredited. This is epitomised by Syriza in Greece, which came to power based on a pledge to oppose austerity, only to implement cuts worse than those that led to the collapse of PASOK. Syriza is now in head-on conflict with the working class after having privatised 14 regional airports, the port of Piraeus, Thessaloniki seaport, cut pensions by 40% with another 20% cut to follow, eviscerated the health service, shed tens of thousands of jobs, brought in anti-strike laws, embraced NATO and a military alliance with Israel. Now, I speak to you from a country which is supposedly breaking this mould, where the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader in 2015 is meant to have signalled the rebirth of the Labour Party. This, at least, is the narrative pushed by Britain's pseudo-left groups, who declared Corbyn's victory a step towards Labour's refounding as a democratic, socialist, anti-austerity party. Events have already disproved such claims. We have documented as a party every retreat made by Corbyn to meet the dictates of the right wing of the Labour Party and of big business. Rather than oppose austerity, Corbyn instructed Labour councils to impose the cuts demanded by the Tories, while his shadow chancellor, John McDonnell, dedicates his days to courting the City of London. Rather than mobilise workers against militarism and war, Corbyn has capitulated on every key issue, allowing a free vote on war in Syria and on the renewal of the Trident nuclear weapons programme as part of NATO's military build-up against Russia. In our appraisal of Corbyn and Labour, we base ourselves on the rich legacy of the Marxist movement and on the analysis made by the International Committee of the Fourth International. Reformism is bourgeois deception of the workers, wrote Lenin, describing it as a disease. With the lineup of the Social Democrats behind their own ruling classes in the First World War, he wrote of the monstrous victory of opportunism, a tendency rooted in, and I quote, a section of the petty bourgeoisie and of certain strata in the working class who have been bribed out of imperialist super profits and converted to watchdogs of capitalism and corrupters of the labour movement. Without a struggle against these parties, he said, there can be no question of a struggle against imperialism or of Marxism or of a socialist labour movement. Trotsky said of Britain's labour lefts, workers must at all costs be shown these self-satisfied pedants, drivelling, eclectics, sentimental careerists, and liveried footmen of the bourgeoisie in their true colours. To show them up for what they are means to discredit them beyond repair. Now, groups such as the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, et al., pass over more than a century of the history of the Labour Party and similar formations. For decades, figures far to the left of Corbyn headed factions or led parties in which millions placed their trust and which had implemented measures that significantly benefited the working class, such as the founding of Britain's National Health Service. Even then, every effort to transform them along socialist lines failed. But those days are long gone. The lurch to the right by the Social Democrats is not the result of a few bad leaders. How does this account for the universal character of the process? It was the necessary response of pro-capitalist parties and politicians to the profound changes associated with globalised production, the integration of finance and manufacturing, and the domination of the world economy by transnational corporations. This rendered the reformist programme of securing social concessions within the framework of the nation state through class collaboration moribund. To compete in globalised markets, the ruling class demanded of the Social Democrats and the trade unions on which they rest that they impose savage cuts and betray strikes, which they have done now for decades. In the process, their relationship to the working class has undergone a fundamental shift, as they have become ever more directly the servants of the financial oligarchy. The pseudo-left groups claim that this has all changed because Labour is led by a nice man with progressive intent. However, their support for Corbyn is not based on such stupid misconceptions, but on political calculations rooted in definite social interests. They represent an upper middle class stratum that views revolution as a threat to the substantial privileges they enjoy, often as advisors to the Labour bureaucracy or leading functionaries within the trade union apparatus. Close to a century and a half after Marx wrote on the Paris Commune, the perspective of the pseudo-left groups is to lay hold not of the state, but of Jeremy Corbyn, and to ride his coattails into the machinery of government. This is what their co-thinkers have done in Greece with Syriza, Portugal's left bloc, Die Linke in Germany, and Podemos in Spain. Should Corbyn come to power, his actions will be the same as Syriza's, to betray the political mandate he was given and pursue the austerity and militarism demanded by the raging crisis of British and world imperialism. The Socialist Equality Party bases its perspective not on ephemeral illusions in figures such as Corbyn or Alexis Tsipras or Pablo Iglesias, but on the reality of existing social relations. There is no possibility of a return to the reformist past of the Labour Party. We live in an era of escalating class struggle, not class compromise, of blood and iron that can only be transcended through world socialist revolution. In the bicentenary year of his birth, the future belongs to Marx and to the great revolutionary tradition defended by Lenin and Trotsky and embodied today in the parties of the ICFI. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Chris. Also speaking from the UK is Julie Hyland, the Assistant National Secretary of the SEP. Julie played a critical role in the defense of Trotskyism in Britain during the split with the national opportunism of the WRP in 1985-86. Since then, she has worked tirelessly to develop and elaborate the perspective of the ICFI in Britain, including countless articles published on the World Socialist website. Welcome, Comrade Julie.
Comrades and friends, this May Day online rally, held on the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, extends its solidarity to the 65.5 million people displaced from their homes due to war, famine, poverty and persecution. Approximately 1 in every 100 people on the planet, the largest number ever recorded. Marx would have understood only too well their plight. He was himself a political refugee, expelled from Germany, France and Belgium for his revolutionary writings, stateless, aged just 27, and living in poverty in England for the remaining majority portion of his life. The grim reality of class relations that he laid bare so unsparingly explains why today there is hardly a safe haven anywhere in the world. A political refugee in England now can expect the type of treatment meted out to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, forced to shelter in the Ecuadorian embassy for almost 6 years and deprived of all communications for exposing imperialist criminality. The UK government recently admitted to imposing a hostile environment, their words, against migrants that has ensnared even members of the so-called Windrush generation, workers from the Caribbean who have lived, worked and raised families in the supposed mother country for decades, have been threatened with deportation and denied housing, medical treatment, work and pensions. There is nothing accidental or peculiar about such actions. A hostile environment for migrants and refugees is exactly what has been created by the ruling elites across the globe as a deliberate policy. In the United States, the right to asylum is under historic attack. In the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, migrants are now hunted down in Gestapo-like raids, shackled and deported, while nearly 200 migrants escaping violence, war and poverty in Central America were left abandoned on the border for days when immigration officials deliberately delayed their applications. On Manus Island, Papua New Guinea, a sadistic crackdown has taken place against refugees protesting their forcible removal to another offshore detention centre. The Australian government insists they must not be allowed to set foot on the mainland at any cost. To force them to submit, water and electricity to the facility has been cut off and medical supplies terminated to hundreds of people, including children, some of whom have attempted suicide over their conditions. In Israel, another nation of immigrants, hundreds of African refugees are currently being rounded up and detained indefinitely in a prison in the Negev desert. Meanwhile, Palestinians protesting their enforced exile from their own land are mowed down by Israeli soldiers. The picture is no better in Europe. In Germany, under the most right-wing government since the Second World War, politicians speak openly of a final solution to the refugee issue, while Chancellor Merkel adopts the language of the AfD to blame refugees for causing division in the country. In France, only last month, the government passed a draconian bill further restricting the right to asylum. President Macron has pompously declared, "We cannot take in all the misery of the world." His statement sums up the callous indifference of the ruling elite. While they must be free to cause misery and mayhem wherever they go, their victims can expect no sanctuary or protection. This is the reality of bourgeois democracy in the epoch of its disintegration. What is described as the refugee problem is really the problem of imperialism. The Western powers bomb Syria, increase their military interventions in the Middle East and Africa, and threaten Iran, Russia, and China. These reckless actions account for the vast increase in the number of refugees, most of whom are trapped in dire circumstances in countries themselves menaced by Western intrigue, such as Lebanon, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Iran. The closest to Europe many migrants will ever get is to Turkey, now host to 3.5 million Syrians alone. The European Union routinely denounces Turkey as authoritarian, but it is only too happy to pay it to be its border guard. Working people must be under no misapprehension. The policies employed against refugees will be turned against them. And this is the case irrespective of whether the parties in charge are nominally left or right, progressive or conservative. It is not merely that the Democrats remain silent in the face of Trump's fascistic measures, they collude with them, as evidenced by the decision of California's Democratic Governor Jerry Brown to deploy 400 soldiers to the border at Trump's request. Or we can take the example of the Syriza government, the so-called coalition of the radical left in Greece, which functions as another principal border guard for the EU. More than 1 million refugees have passed through Greek islands such as Lesbos in the last 3 years. Thousands are still forcibly detained in inhumane conditions, overwhelming already dwindling resources and services, and subject to violent attacks by far-right groups. Now, this is not the unfortunate result of demands made of Syriza against its will. It is the outcome of the calculated political decision made by Alexis Tsipras and his pseudo-left allies when they betrayed a massive mandate to fight austerity and joined forces instead with the EU to impose its assault on working people. The measures against refugees and migrants and the attack on workers' jobs and living standards are two sides of the same class policy. Poverty and unemployment now rival war as the major causes of migration. Nearly 250 million people are classed as international migrants, forced to leave their homes and families in search of work. The cause is clear. While, especially since 2008, working people everywhere have seen significant falls in their living standards, the wealth of the world's richest 1% since that time has been growing at an average of 6% a year. Just 42 people own the same amount of wealth as the poorest 50% worldwide. But you will search in vain for a single significant policy to redress this glaring social inequality in the programme of Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, et al. Yet they, like others in the trade unions and the pseudo-left parties, will demand restrictions on freedom of movement, especially against those deemed to be economic migrants, on the spurious basis that this is in the best interests of the working class. Some even claim they're following the policy of Karl Marx. Such a monstrous distortion cannot be allowed to stand. These organisations have nothing in common with the founder of scientific socialism. Their call for border controls is the outcome of their perspective of national economic regulation under capitalism. Not only is this diametrically opposed to the perspective of revolutionary socialist internationalism elaborated by Marx, their defence of the state apparatus leads inexorably to support for police state measures at home and imperialist war abroad. Marx was very clear on these questions, and his conclusion to the inaugural address of the International Working Men's Association, the First International, in 1864 is of immense contemporary relevance. Past experience, he said, has shown how disregard of that bond of brotherhood which ought to exist between the workmen of different countries and incites them to stand firmly by each other in all their struggles for emancipation, will be chastised by the common discomfiture of their incoherent efforts. It was the duty of the working classes, he went on, to master themselves the mysteries of international politics, to watch the diplomatic acts of their respective governments, to counteract them, if necessary, by all means in their power, and when unable to prevent, to combine in simultaneous denunciations and to vindicate the simple laws of morals and justice which ought to govern the relations of private individuals. The fight, he continued, for such a foreign policy forms part of the general struggle for the emancipation of the working classes. Proletarians of all countries, unite. Comrades, this is the perspective carried forward today only by the International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Julie. Before proceeding, I should make an announcement that the live feed on the Facebook of this rally has been ended. It's unclear why. They haven't given any reason for why the live feed was cut off. It's still going out on YouTube, where most of our listeners are listening to the rally. But it's certainly the case that Facebook in recent months and over the past year has taken aggressive measures to cut down on the spread of left-wing and oppositional political views, and in particularly cutting down on the spread of viral videos, as the founder of and CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, has made repeatedly clear. But the Facebook feed, in any case, has been cut off from the live stream. We are still streaming on YouTube. Joining us now from Paris is Comrade Alex Lantier, the leader of the French section of the International Committee, the Parti de l'Égalité Socialiste, founded in November 2016. The PES is fighting to develop a Trotskyist movement in France against the reactionary government of Emmanuel Macron and the Pabloite and pseudo-left organizations that serve as a critical bulwark for bourgeois rule. Comrade Alex will be speaking in French with the English translation presented on the video feed. Welcome, Comrade Alex.
Sur ce bicentenaire de la naissance de Karl Marx, je présente les salutations fraternelles du Parti de l'égalité socialiste. Le manifeste du Parti communiste, la polémique de Marx contre la trahison de la révolution de 1848 par la petite bourgeoisie démocratique et sa dénonciation en 1871 du massacre de la Commune de Paris lui ont valu l'admiration éternelle du prolétariat en France. Et on peut prédire que l'actuelle montée de la lutte des classes 200 ans après sa naissance ne fera que grandir l'estime dans laquelle les travailleurs le tiennent autour du monde. En France, sur fond de colère croissante contre la politique d'austérité d'Emmanuel Macron et contre ses frappes en Syrie aux côtés de Washington et de Londres, les travailleurs font grève contre la privatisation de la SNCF. Les étudiants occupent de nombreuses universités. On voit sur de nombreux murs de Paris le graffiti 1968-2018. Tout le monde pense à la dernière grande expérience révolutionnaire de la classe ouvrière en France il y a 50 ans, la grève générale de mai 68. Et les 50 dernières années ont aussi répondu à une question qui s'avérera décisive dans les luttes à venir. Qui sont les marxistes de France? C'est le Comité international de la 4e internationale, le CIQI, et sa section française, le PES. Seul le CIQI soulève toujours la nécessité d'une lutte de la classe ouvrière pour prendre le pouvoir et lutte également pour l'indépendance politique des travailleurs vis-à-vis des staliniens, des maoïstes et les divers partis petits bourgeois qui ont rompu avec le trotskisme. Pour comprendre leur rôle contre-révolutionnaire aujourd'hui, il faut voir ce qu'ils disent de leur propre histoire. Tous proclament à présent que 1968 n'était pas une crise révolutionnaire. Quel mensonge! En 1968, la classe ouvrière a ébranlé les fondements du capitalisme français. Après une semaine de répression violente des manifestations d'étudiants, une grève générale de plus de 10 millions de travailleurs a explosé. Au-dessus des usines, on hissait le drapeau rouge. La question était posée. La classe ouvrière prendrait-elle le pouvoir en France en 1968, comme elle l'avait fait en Russie en 1917? Mais deux grands facteurs ont sauvé le capitalisme. Primo, le Parti communiste français, le PCF stalinien, alors le parti hégémonique parmi les travailleurs, a stoppé et bloqué une révolution. Il a fait pression pour les travailleurs pour qu'ils reprennent le travail en échange d'augmentation de salaire et ainsi démoraliser les travailleurs en trahissant la situation révolutionnaire. Secundo, c'était encore l'époque du boom économique des 30 Glorieuses. La bourgeoisie avait de quoi augmenter les salaires, gagner du temps et préparer sa riposte. En préparant cette riposte, elle s'est trouvée de nouveaux alliés parmi des groupes étudiants petits bourgeois, qui soient maoïstes, ou les étudiants qui s'étaient ralliés au pablisme, la tendance anti-trotskiste qui avait rompu avec le CIQI en 1953. Manifester pour eux, c'était une chose. Mais ces fils de la bourgeoisie et de la petite bourgeoisie ont été atterrés quand le danger d'une révolution prolétarienne est apparu devant eux, dans la rue. Et depuis, en s'enrichissant avec l'âge, ils sont devenus des soutiens aisés et conformistes du régime capitaliste, favorables à Macron et à la guerre. Ils se targuent à présent de leur rôle contre-révolutionnaire en 1968. Pendant la grève générale, alors que la police s'évaporait et d'immenses manifestations parcouraient Paris, les dirigeants étudiants contactaient le ministère de l'Intérieur. Il n'est venu à l'esprit de personne d'aller prendre un ministère ou de marcher sur l'Élysée. On n'avait aucune perspective d'ordre politique, a déclaré le maoïste Jean-Pierre Le Dantec, qui a soutenu Macron en 2017. À la manifestation du 24 mars 1968, les étudiants pablistes ont même disposé leurs services d'ordre autour des armureries pour arrêter les travailleurs au cas où ils voudraient prendre les armes. En 2009, parlant au Nouvel Observateur, leur chef Alain Krivine a expliqué « Nous savions jusqu'où il ne fallait pas aller ». Puis il a applaudi le préfet de Paris en 1968, le chef de police Maurice Grimaud. D'un côté, il était le chef des flics, de l'autre, c'était un haut fonctionnaire républicain, de gauche. Grimaud, selon Krivine, était, et je cite, un type bien. Et finalement, il y avait Daniel Cohn-Bendit, l'icône des étudiants en 1968. Il est devenu un député vert et en 2017 s'est dit rallié à Macron. Son credo anti-marxiste, exposé en 1968 dans son livre « Le gauchisme, remède à la maladie sénile du communisme », était réactionnaire. Cet opposant prétendument démocratique du marxisme est devenu un chaud partisan des guerres humanitaires, dont celle de l'OTAN en Libye en 2011, et aussi de Macron, qui a pris le pouvoir sous le régime autoritaire de l'état d'urgence. Tous ces personnages ont appuyé le Parti socialiste, un parti bourgeois fondé en 1971 qui a joué le rôle central dans la contre-offensive de la bourgeoisie après 1968. Sur 5 décennies, les divers gouvernements PS ont imposé l'austérité, attaqué l'industrie, augmenté le chômage et lancé des guerres néocoloniales au Moyen-Orient et en Afrique. Et finalement, également, l'Organisation communiste internationaliste, l'OCI, a rompu avec le CIQI sur une perspective nationaliste cette même année en 1971. Elle s'est liquidée dans le PS en appuyant l'alliance entre le PS et le PCF qui a remporté les élections de 1981. Les membres de l'OCI travaillaient à la fois dans le PS et dans l'OCI. L'un d'eux, Lionel Jospin, est devenu Premier ministre. Un autre, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, est devenu ministre. Il dirige à présent la France insoumise, dont les députés aident Macron à planifier le retour au service militaire. Mais, comme expliquait Trotsky, les lois de l'histoire sont plus fortes que les appareils bureaucratiques. 50 ans après 1968, 27 ans après la dissolution de l'URSS, le PS s'est effondré, ainsi que toute une série de partis social-démocrates discrédités, austéritaires et militaristes à travers l'Europe. Macron, l'ancien ministre de l'économie PS, en est ressorti l'année dernière. Le régime Macron ne tolérera pas d'issue réformiste à la lutte des classes, comme en 1968. Il veut à tout prix verser des centaines de milliards d'euros aux banques et aux armées. Mais ses projets pour anéantir les acquis sociaux, afin de participer aux menaces de guerre contre l'Iran, la Russie et la Chine, ne sont pas des signes de force, mais plutôt des signes d'une crise mortelle du capitalisme mondial. La classe ouvrière n'aura d'autre choix que de construire un mouvement qui visera à prendre le pouvoir en France et à travers le monde. Et en 2016, le CIQI a fondé le PES pour offrir une direction révolutionnaire trotskiste aux luttes à venir. Le PES souligne que la responsabilité pour les défaites des luttes depuis 1968 n'incombe ni à la classe ouvrière ni au marxisme, mais au charlatanisme des organisations qui se sont faussement réclamées du marxisme. Et pour aller de l'avant, il s'agit de retourner aux traditions du marxisme classique, à la classe ouvrière et à la construction de son avant-garde révolutionnaire. Contre l'engeance petite bourgeoise post-68ard, le PES reprend à son compte le jugement dévastateur porté sur les démocrates petits bourgeois de 1848 par le révolutionnaire français du XIXe siècle, Auguste Blanqui. Ces paroles, citées par Marx et Engels en 1851, sont toujours d'une actualité brûlante aujourd'hui. Blanqui disait « Entre tous, les plus coupables sont ceux en qui le peuple, trompé par des phrases de tribun, voyait son épée et son bouclier, ceux qu'il proclamait avec enthousiasme les arbitres de son avenir. Que les travailleurs aient sans cesse devant les yeux cette liste de noms maudits, et si un seul apparaissait jamais dans un gouvernement sorti de l'insurrection, qu'ils crient tous d'une voix « trahison ». Et puis, Blanqui a posé deux alternatives au peuple français qui sont toujours celles posées aujourd'hui aux travailleurs de France et de tous les pays. D'un côté, si les prolétaires construisent un mouvement révolutionnaire puissant, écrit-il, obstacles, résistance, impossibilité, tout disparaîtra. Mais par contre, pour les prolétaires qui se laissent amuser par des promenades ridicules dans les rues, par des plantations d'arbres de la liberté et par des phrases sonores d'avocats, il y aura de l'eau bénite d'abord, des injures ensuite, enfin de la mitraille, mais de la misère toujours. Et il a présenté ce que nous présentons aujourd'hui, maintenant que le peuple choisisse. Merci, camarades.
Thank you, Comrade Alex. Our final speaker today is Comrade Bill Van Auken. Readers of the World Socialist website well know Comrade Van for his almost daily articles on the political situation in the United States and the wars of American imperialism. He is also the Latin America editor for the World Socialist website, and he will be speaking today on the situation in Latin America and the tasks facing the Latin American working class. Welcome, Comrade Van.
Dear comrades and friends, as we commemorate May Day and today's 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, the resurgence of the class struggle that is shaking political and social relations on a global scale is finding particularly sharp expression within Latin America, the most socially unequal continent on this planet. As in the United States and elsewhere in the world, teachers have taken a lead in the renewed upsurge of the class struggle, going on strike and taking to the streets from Sao Paulo to Buenos Aires, from Santiago, Chile to Mexico City and San Juan, Puerto Rico, to fight against the decimation of public education and defend their living standards and basic rights. In many instances, these struggles have been met with naked police repression. The new crop of right-wing governments, Macri in Argentina, Temer in Brazil, Piñera in Chile, are no more able to resolve the crisis gripping the capitalist system in Latin America than their supposedly left predecessors. Like them, mired in filthy corruption scandals, their only answer is to shift the burden onto the backs of the working class. As the Latin American working class once again moves towards revolutionary struggles, it is high time for drawing up an unsparing balance sheet of the betrayals of past struggles and the role played by leaderships that have done everything in their power to disorient and to mislead the working class. The emancipation of workers must be the act of the working class itself, Marx and Engels famously insisted. This essential affirmation of the role of the working class as the sole consistently revolutionary class in capitalist society, and of the impossibility of establishing socialism under the leadership of any supposedly radical or left section of the bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie, has been confirmed again and again through tragic historical experiences in Latin America. The International Committee of the Fourth International has insisted that defeating the attacks carried out by both imperialism and the native Latin American bourgeoisie is possible only through the independent mobilization of the working class throughout the Americas based upon a revolutionary, socialist, and internationalist program. The ICFI has waged a decades-long battle against all those who have promoted one or another bourgeois or petty bourgeois movement as a substitute for the decisive task of building revolutionary Marxist parties in the working class. Left nationalism, with the fawning support of petty bourgeois radicals in Europe and North America, has played a catastrophic role in Latin America. This found its consummate expression in the development of the thesis that the coming to power of Fidel Castro in Cuba had opened up a new road to socialism, which no longer required either the conscious and independent political intervention of the working class or the building of revolutionary Marxist parties. Instead, guerrilla warfare waged by small groups of armed men under the leadership of radical petty bourgeois nationalists would suffice. This myth, derived from the coming to power of Castro's July 26 movement, was distilled into the retrograde theories of guerrillism elaborated by his erstwhile political ally Che Guevara as the model for revolutions throughout the hemisphere. This false perspective found its most prominent proponents in the Pabloite revisionist tendency that emerged within the Fourth International under the leadership of Ernest Mandel in Europe and Joseph Hansen in the United States, subsequently joined by Nahuel Moreno in Argentina. This anti-Marxist perspective was propagated throughout Latin America with disastrous consequences. It served to divert a layer of radicalized youth away from the struggle to build a conscious revolutionary leadership in the working class and into grossly unequal armed confrontations that claimed the lives of thousands and helped to pave the way to fascist military dictatorships throughout the continent. The International Committee of the Fourth International fought intransigently against this Pabloite perspective. Defending Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, the ICFI insisted that Castroism did not constitute any new road to socialism. Rather, it represented only one of the more radical variants of bourgeois nationalist movements that had come to power throughout the former colonial world in the post-World War II era. The ICFI warned that the Pabloites' elevation of Castro as a, quote, natural Marxist entailed the wholesale repudiation of the historical and theoretical conception of the socialist revolution going back to Marx, and laid the basis for the liquidation of the revolutionary cadre assembled by the Trotskyist movement internationally into the camp of bourgeois nationalism and Stalinism. Last month saw the formal end of the nearly 6-decade rule of the Castro brothers under conditions of mounting social inequality in Cuba and the attempt by the ruling strata of the island to salvage its privileges by means of a rapprochement with U.S. imperialism. Today, deals signed with Obama remain in abeyance as Trump demands even greater concessions from Havana and promotes the activities of the rabid anti-Castroites in Miami while threatening a renewal of U.S. aggression. The fate of Cuba will be determined by the development of the class struggle and the struggle to build a new revolutionary leadership in the working class, both on that island as well as in the United States and throughout the Americas. The same Pabloite revisionists who promoted Castroism went on to declare the Sandinista Liberation Front in Nicaragua and the Farabundo Martí Front in El Salvador as the basis for a new path to socialism and even the foundation for a new revolutionary international. Despite the immense heroism and sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of lives in the struggle against U.S.-backed dictatorships and CIA terrorist armies in Central America, both these movements transformed themselves into bourgeois parties, made peace with the reactionary ruling oligarchies they had previously opposed, and became faithful executors of the austerity programs of the International Monetary Fund. Last month saw the Sandinista leader Daniel Ortega, who has amassed personal wealth and power rivaling that of the former dictator Somoza, unleash violent repression against workers and youth protesting against draconian cuts to pensions, leaving some 30 dead. Last month also saw the jailing on trumped-up corruption charges of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the former metal workers leader who became the president of Brazil as the leader of the Workers' Party, or Partido dos Trabalhadores, or PT. Many of the same Pabloites and Morenoite revisionists who had previously extolled the virtues of Castroism and Sandinismo presented the PT as a new, uniquely Brazilian road to socialism. They entered and helped build the PT into what became a thoroughly corrupt bourgeois party that for a dozen years served as the preferred instrument of rule of the Brazilian bourgeoisie. It is telling that Lula's imprisonment by the right-wing government of Michel Temer has produced no mass outcry from Brazilian workers who saw their living standards and rights subjected to sharp attacks by PT governments with the collaboration of the party's affiliated trade unions. A tendency that learns nothing and forgets nothing, the Morenoites, having seen their Brazilian adherents long since expelled from the PT, have concentrated their efforts on a series of unprincipled electoral alliances and maneuvers within the trade unions and parliamentary arenas in Argentina. The logic of this activity is directed toward the creation of a new left bourgeois party, along the lines of Podemos in Spain or Syriza in Greece, to serve as a trap for workers coming into struggle. As its principal ally in these perennial unprincipled electoral alliances is acknowledged in a candid, though one must say self-incriminating fashion last year, the PTS, the main continuator of the discredited politics of Morenoism in Argentina, represented a Podemos in diapers. Finally, there was a fraud of Bolivarian or 21st century socialism introduced with the coming to power of the former Army Colonel Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. While able to adopt a left posture and provide minimal social assistance programs to the working class under conditions of rising oil prices, with the collapse of the commodity boom, this bourgeois nationalist movement, based firmly on the military, has turned sharply against the working class. Its policies have enriched a layer of financiers, commodity speculators, and senior military officers, while upholding the interests of the international finance capital, even as workers confront growing hunger and unemployment. Meanwhile, the government of Rafael Correa, another proponent of Bolivarianism and 21st century socialism, has given way to that of his hand-picked successor, Lenin Moreno. While introducing a series of capitalist counter-reforms, Moreno has sought to curry favor with U.S. and British imperialism by means of a grotesquely reactionary betrayal. It has cut off WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's internet access and barred him receiving visitors at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he has been a virtual prisoner for nearly 6 years. As Moreno's government seeks closer ties with the U.S. military and the Trump administration, it collaborates in suppressing a man pursued by Washington for exposing the crimes of U.S. imperialism. Such is the logic of bourgeois nationalism. These bitter experiences with the politics of bourgeois nationalism and its Pabloite and other petty bourgeois pseudo-left props underscore the necessity of forging a new revolutionary Marxist movement based upon the independent mobilization of the working class and the unification of workers in Latin America with workers in the United States and internationally in a common struggle to put an end to capitalism. We appeal to our comrades in Latin America, those participating in this online rally, those who read the World Socialist website, and all those workers and youth seeking a revolutionary path. The history of the class struggle in Latin America is one not merely of betrayals, but of immense heroism, self-sacrifice, and determination, all of which will be summed up in the revolutionary battles to come. The decisive question, however, is to learn the lessons of the past so that the mistakes and betrayals will not be repeated. This, above all, means the study and assimilation of the long history of struggle waged by Trotskyism and revisionism, and on this principled foundation, building sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International in every country. Hacemos un llamado a nuestros camaradas en América Latina, a quienes están participando en este mitin en línea, a quienes leen el World Socialist website y a todos los trabajadores y jóvenes buscando un camino revolucionario. La historia de la lucha de clases en América Latina no solo está compuesta de traiciones, sino también de inmenso heroísmo, autosacrificio y determinación, atributos que serán invocadas en las batallas revolucionarias venideras. Sin embargo, la cuestión determinante será aprender las lecciones del pasado para que no se repitan errores ni traiciones. Ante todo, esto significa estudiar y asimilar las enseñanzas de la larga historia de luchas del trotskismo contra el revisionismo y con base en estos principios fundamentales construir secciones del Comité Internacional de la Cuarta Internacional en cada país.
Thank you, Comrade Van. And thank you to all speakers who have contributed today and to all those who have listened in and contributed to the discussion online. This has been a powerful rally and one that is absolutely unique. It is the only event marking May Day and Marx's bicentenary that has presented to the working class a genuinely Marxist and socialist perspective in response to imperialist violence, authoritarianism, exploitation, and censorship. Bringing together workers from around the world, the rally has embodied the call sounded by Marx and Engels more than 150 years ago: workers of the world, unite. I'd like to conclude with a few points. What does this rally represent politically? The world is fraught with danger and crisis, as the speeches today have made clear. The ruling class is going on the offensive. It's seeking to rip up everything, to destroy pensions and health care, to destroy wages, to organize a further transfer of wealth from the working class of the world to the corporate and financial elite. The Trump administration here in the United States is the embodiment of all that is filthy and reactionary in the corporate and financial aristocracy. The criminality and corruption has been vomited up in the present administration. But what do the Democrats, the nominal opposition, represent? What do they propose? a neo-McCarthyite campaign centered on demands for further aggression in the Middle East and against Russia, a campaign that is being used to justify the censorship of the internet, the greatest attack on free speech since the Second World War. This is an international process. The rise of far-right forces, as many of this remarks have pointed to, the AfD in Germany, far-right movements throughout Europe are on the rise. Yet the traditional bourgeois parties, what do they offer? Macron in France is carrying out a vicious assault on the working class. The traditional parties of the bourgeoisie internationally, like the Democrats here in the United States, are carrying out an offensive against the working class, an offensive against democratic rights, and preparations for war. The danger of world war is extreme and immense. Over the past several months, the American ruling class has launched bombings against Syria with enormous consequences. No discussion in the media about what are the implications of a war with Russia, a war in the Pacific. Yet this is what is being planned by the ruling classes. And in think tanks and military reports, the generals have said that the war on terror is over, and now it will be a war involving great powers. At the same time, the conditions facing the vast majority of the population all over the world are declining. Workers face brutal exploitation and the destruction of basic social services and jobs. As Comrade Julie's report made clear, there's one expression of the assault on the working class is the horrific conditions facing refugees all over the world. We'll talk, as she pointed out, to final solutions to refugee problems. All the filth and the horrors of the 20th century are being rejected. However, there is another side to this same process. The ruling class and its state and media instruments are powerful, but the international working class is more powerful when it is united and organized into a political movement. As Marx insisted, the contradictions of capitalism not only produce misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation, and war, they also produce the revolt of the working class. There is not only misery, Marx wrote in 1847, but also the revolutionary side of misery, which will overthrow the old society. We are marking at this rally 200 years since the birth of Marx. Of course, there have been immense changes since Marx's time. However, we live very much in the era of Marx. Indeed, the tendencies to which he pointed have developed enormously over the past 150 years. The global integration of production, the growth of the working class, and above all, the antagonism between the working class, the vast majority of the world's population, and the bourgeoisie. And we are beginning to see this antagonism burst into the open with the development of the class struggle all over the world. Comrade Vijay in his report cited the Chinese saying, which I thought was an apt one. The wind sweeping through the tower heralds a storm rising on the mountain. And it is an incredibly powerful storm that is rising. In the first May Day rally that we held in 2014, we made the point that the American working class is the sleeping giant of world politics. And now that working class is rising and fighting back as part of an international movement of the working class. Comrade Vijay also cited the statement of the Indian corporations, this vicious statement that they, in response to any threat of opposition, that they will do a Maruti Suzuki. That is, that they will carry out a brutal repression of opposition. Well, the workers will respond in like kind. Indeed, the call of workers to do a West Virginia is one which has been made by teachers over the past several months, by which they meant that they will carry out a fight as the teachers did in West Virginia. And that will happen. There'll be a growth of the class struggle, development of struggles, not only in the United States, but all over the world. But what is above all required is that the lessons be learned. The lessons be learned about the role of the trade unions, about the role of the parties of the ruling class, about the role of the upper middle class organizations that promote the unions, that promote the politics of race and gender and identity, that seek to oppose and undermine the independent mobilization of the working class. A new politics is necessary, a socialist politics, It's necessary not to be swept behind the political establishment by nice men like Corbyn. Of course, we have our own nice man here in the United States in the form of Bernie Sanders, who ran in the last elections and got millions of votes from young people and workers. And what has become of that nice man? He's now in a major figure in the U.S. Senate, fully supporting the anti-Russia campaign, the bombing of Syria, the attack on immigrants. Such is the outcome of such nice politics. Or, of course, the reactionary Tsipras in Greece, who's the front line in the assault on immigrant workers and the demands of the banks of Europe. Of course, there'll be countless others that will be brought forward to divert and channel the class struggle. However, a different type of politics is necessary and a different type of politics is advancing. The future is socialism. The political perspective outlined at this rally is that which must guide millions of workers entering into struggle against the capitalist system. The perpetuation of the capitalist system means world war, dictatorship, ever greater levels of inequality. The alternative is socialism, the reorganization of economic life to meet social need and not private profit. In Comrade North's introduction, he stressed that Marxism is scientific socialism. It is rooted in the indissoluble connection between the scientific analysis of the capitalist system and political practice. As Comrade North stressed, the ideas of Marx were inseparable from his political activity, and the ideas of Marxism today are inseparable from the fight to mobilize the working class in the struggle for power. The essential task is the building of a revolutionary leadership, as the speakers today stressed. This revolutionary leadership is the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement. The ideas of Marx and the perspective of the Marxist movement must be brought into the practice of the working class. But the ICFI is the Marxist movement. The Marxism of the 21st century is Trotskyism. We celebrate Marx, but based on the historical development of Marxism in the 20th and 21st century. We call on all those listening today, now is not the time to stand on the sidelines. It is the time to take an active part in the fight for socialism. I want to conclude this rally with an appeal to all those listening to join the Fourth International. Join the Socialist Equality Party in your country. To young people, join the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. Participate in the fight to organize and mobilize workers all over the world in a revolutionary movement to overturn the capitalist system, end inequality and war, and establish a society based on equality and socialism. Thank you.